Hi everybody. Tonight we begin a journey through shadowed corridors of time, a tale that lies half buried beneath the silken veils of power, passion and peril. You may know of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony and the enchanting Cleopatra, names etched into the stone of memory, legends painted in the golds and crimsons of ambition and love. But what if beneath the grandeur of this fabled triangle something darker pulsed? Something unwholesome, like secrets whispered behind imperial drapes. This story, told softly and slowly, will guide you not through battles and glories alone, but into the quiet spaces between, where betrayal kisses loyalty, and where love, when twisted by power, becomes a ghost that never leaves. Now let your thoughts slow, your breath deepen. For we begin, not in Rome nor in Alexandria, but in the hush of a moment long ago. It was the spring of 49 BC, and Rome trembled with the faint rustle of destiny. In a small courtyard nestled behind a marble colonnade, Julius Caesar sat alone beneath an olive tree. He was not the conqueror yet. Not quite. There was something still human in his face, an openness like parchment awaiting the first scratch of ink. He traced the rim of a silver cup absently, his thoughts tangled not in politics, but in a letter sealed in wax lying on the low table beside him. The letter had come from Egypt. Its sender, Cleopatra the Seventh Philopator, Queen of the Nile, a woman known by whispers rather than facts. Few in Rome had seen her, and fewer still understood her. Some said she was too clever for a woman. Others whispered that she had the eyes of a serpent and the voice of a dream. But Caesar, he saw in her not merely an exotic ruler, but a mirror, a sovereign shaped by turmoil, walking the edge of ruin with poise and brilliance. Their correspondence had begun as diplomacy. Trade routes, olive shipments and coinage standards. But beneath the ink something deeper stirred. Cleopatra wrote as if each word was a silk thread tying their minds together. Caesar, who had grown weary of Rome's rigid masks and poison-tipped Senate games, found her letters intoxicating. She spoke of philosophy, of destiny, of the stars that burned above both Rome and Egypt as if they were the same sky. She made him feel timeless. But Cleopatra had reasons for her tenderness. Egypt was crumbling, eaten by internal strife and Roman greed. Her brother-husband Ptolemy XIII, though a child, had seized power with the help of courtiers loyal to gold rather than blood. Cleopatra had been driven from Alexandria, and now lived cloaked and silent in the desert fringes, seeking allies among those who still remembered the old ways. The letter invited Caesar to Alexandria, not as a conqueror, but as a guest. "Come," it said, "and I will show you a kingdom beneath its skin." And Caesar, ever the strategist, saw opportunity. If he helped Cleopatra regain her throne, he could stabilize Egypt, Rome's breadbasket, and extend his influence deep into the east. He packed lightly and set sail under the pretense of Roman order. But as the ship cut through the seafoam, he wondered if he was chasing politics or something far more perilous. The city of Alexandria unfurled before him like a dream cast in alabaster and emerald. Minarets pierced the horizon, domes shimmered like pearls under the Egyptian sun, and everywhere, fragrance, jasmine, incense, dates split open on silver platters. But it was the silence in the corners that caught Caesar's attention. Eyes watched from behind silken curtains, words hushed as he passed. Alexandria was a city beautiful on the surface, but restless beneath. That first night, Caesar was taken to the royal palace under a moon as round and golden as a pharaoh's medallion. There, in the Hall of Winds, Cleopatra made her entrance, not through pomp or parade, but in silence. Hidden in a rolled carpet carried by loyal servants, she was unfurled before Caesar's astonished eyes, like a spell being cast. She stood then, tall and calm, robed in linen the colour of old ivory, with kohl around her eyes so thick it seemed she wept shadow. Caesar did not speak, neither did she. They simply looked at one another, and in that gaze, the first thread of their bond was knotted tight. Cleopatra was unlike any woman Caesar had known. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if time itself waited for her. She spoke 7 languages. She could recite Homer by heart and argue Euclid's theorems in the same breath she used to whisper about prophecy and dreams. And yet, it was not her mind alone that captivated him. It was her mourning, the soft, aching grief she wore like a necklace. She mourned a kingdom not yet lost, a people sliding into servitude, a mother who had died poisoned in the very halls where they now whispered. She mourned her own name, stripped of power, spoken with mockery by the courtiers who supported her brother. But more than anything, Cleopatra mourned the truth, that power could never be held with both hands and a clean conscience. In the weeks that followed, Caesar moved little beyond the palace walls. He wrote dispatches to Rome sparingly. Mark Antony, his trusted general, was left behind in Greece to handle the Republic's simmering unrest. And so it was in the marble hush of Alexandria's gardens that the bond between Caesar and Cleopatra grew. But something else grew too, something hidden in the quiet spaces. For Cleopatra's youngest sister Arsinoe watched them with a venomous curiosity. She had once been Cleopatra's shadow, a child desperate for affection. Now she saw in her sister not a queen in exile, but a usurper wrapped in Roman silk. Arsinoe began to plot. Small things at first, words whispered to guards, messages sent under fruit baskets. She wrote to Ptolemy's advisers and offered them loyalty, even as she smiled at Caesar in the corridors. But the darkest truth, the one no scroll dares record, was this. Cleopatra did not merely want to regain her throne. She wanted to remake Egypt. And to do so, she needed not just Caesar's armies, but Caesar's heart. And Caesar, weary, aging but hungry for immortality, began to wonder what it might mean to become more than Roman, what it might mean to become legend. Thus the first strand of the triangle was drawn. Not yet a tangle, but a line, delicate, trembling, waiting. And far to the north, across the blue leagues of sea, Mark Antony was beginning to dream of fires he could not explain. Fires that would soon lead him south, into the arms of destiny, betrayal, and the woman who would burn Rome itself into memory. Let your breath slow now. The moon is high and the past is patient. Tomorrow we return to Alexandria, where veils are lifting and shadows deepen. The days in Alexandria melted into one another like drops of honey falling into still water. Julius Caesar remained within the labyrinth of the royal palace, wandering corridors that whispered with every step. The walls seemed alive with the sighs of forgotten pharaohs and the murmurs of veiled servants. Alexandria, in its heart, was a city that belonged to the shadows, and Cleopatra, ever poised, walked as though she commanded every last flicker of those shadows. By the third week of his stay, Caesar no longer viewed his presence in Egypt as a mere political maneuver. He had begun to see the kingdom and its queen as a key to something larger than Roman conquest. He, the master of legions, who had crossed the Rubicon and defied a senate bound in its own shackles, now faced a new temptation, the dream of a legacy carved not in marble alone, but in the hearts of nations. Cleopatra spoke to him each night in the perfumed hall, a chamber gilded with lapis lazuli, where the air hung heavy with frankincense and myrrh. They spoke of Rome, yes, but more often of destiny and eternity. Cleopatra spun visions of an empire that stretched beyond borders, beyond bloodlines. Her voice carried the weight of ancient kings and vanished gods. She spoke of Isis and Osiris, of Alexander the Great, whose bones rested not far from their chamber. She called upon histories older than Rome itself, and Caesar, despite himself, listened like a boy lulled by a song he had known in some forgotten dream. Yet beneath the golden words and soft glances there lurked a quiet unrest. For every soft word Cleopatra spoke, there was a name she dared not say aloud: Arsinoe. The young sister, with her pale eyes and serpent's grace, moved in the background of the palace like a phantom. To the servants she offered sweet smiles and easy laughter. But those who crossed her gaze too long noticed the ice beneath her charm. She listened, always listening. Every whispered plan between Caesar and Cleopatra was somehow known to her before dawn broke. Every movement of the Roman guards posted by Caesar's command reached Arsinoe's ears before the torches were lit at dusk. And so it happened that on the 24th night, as the stars hung soft and low over Alexandria, a quiet handmaid, one who had served Cleopatra since childhood, disappeared. No one spoke her name. The next morning, her body was found beneath the great bridge that crossed the royal canal, her throat bearing the faint mark of a slender cord. The palace fell into a hush deeper than before. Cleopatra said nothing. But that night, when Caesar entered the perfumed hall, she sat not on her gilded chair, but on the cool marble floor. Her crown lay beside her, tilted slightly as though it had slipped in sleep. "You have many enemies," Caesar said quietly, watching her with a gaze half-shadowed. Cleopatra's eyes, dark as ink against her coal-lined lids, met his steadily. In Egypt, enemies wear many faces. Some even wear mine. It was not fear in her voice, nor sorrow. It was something else, a quiet admission of a game that had begun long before Caesar set foot on Egyptian sand. And in that moment, a thin thread of doubt wound its way into Caesar's heart. Was he a player in this intricate dance of politics and power, or merely a pawn being moved by unseen hands? But desire, sharp as a drawn dagger, dulled the edge of his suspicion. Cleopatra's presence was a balm against the slow rot of Roman politics. In her he saw not just beauty, but the possibility of something eternal, a queen who could stand beside him as empires rose and fell beneath their gaze. They spent that night speaking of stars and fate, and when the dawn crept pale and shy over Alexandria, Caesar left her chamber with a heart heavier than before. For in the deepest part of himself, Caesar began to suspect that Cleopatra's invitation had never been for Rome's sake, nor even for Egypt's. It had been for something darker, an empire of hearts, bound by chains softer than silk and stronger than steel. And beyond the walls of the palace, as the Nile lapped softly against the docks, Mark Antony awoke from a dream in a camp far from Alexandria. In his vision, a woman with eyes like molten gold had whispered his name, not in affection, but in a command. He sat up, breath tight in his chest, the scent of jasmine clinging to his thoughts. He did not know yet that fate had begun its quiet march toward him. Back in the palace, Arsinoe knelt in her chamber, fingers coiled around a slender dagger carved from obsidian. She whispered to the shadows, her voice soft as a lullaby, weaving plans no sister should ever weave. The love that was beginning to bind Caesar and Cleopatra was not yet a triangle, but its third side was already casting its shadow, and that shadow belonged not only to Mark Antony, nor even to the fates of Rome and Egypt, but to the darkness that awakens when love, power, and betrayal begin to breathe in the same chamber. Night deepened over Alexandria, and the stars burned cold and patient. The hearts of 3 rulers, one Roman, one Egyptian, and one who had yet to step into his destined place, beat in quiet rhythm with a world on the cusp of unravelling. But for now, all remained still. The lull before a storm that would change the course of history and leave behind truths darker than any sword's shadow. The dawn that followed settled upon Alexandria with a hush so profound it seemed even the waves dared not disturb the stillness. Julius Caesar stood alone on a marble balcony overlooking the royal harbour. Below him, the waters stretched out in gleaming ribbons of silver and sapphire, kissed by the softest breath of wind. Ships bobbed lazily in their moorings, Roman triremes among slender Egyptian barges, and in the distance the colossal Pharos lighthouse stood sentinel, its flame a faint whisper against the morning sky. Caesar's hands rested upon the cool stone rail, yet his mind was far from the view before him. His thoughts swirled like the eddies beneath the palace docks. He could not shake the weight of Cleopatra's words from the night before, nor the hollow chill of the murdered handmaid's fate. Alexandria cloaked its secrets well, but Caesar, a man seasoned in the art of intrigue, sensed that he had entered a web woven long before his arrival, a web from which even a conqueror might not easily escape. Behind him, soft footsteps approached, light, deliberate, familiar. Cleopatra moved as if the world around her shifted in deference to her presence. When she reached his side, she placed one slender hand upon the balustrade, not touching him, but standing so near that the faint perfume of lotus blossoms lingered between them. "Do you find Egypt so troublesome already?" she asked, her voice soft with a wry, nearly playful undertone. Caesar glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Troublesome nations are nothing new to me, but troublesome queens, they require a different sort of understanding." A faint smile touched Cleopatra's lips, though it did not reach her eyes. "And have you come to understand me, Julius?" There was a long silence between them, filled only by the gentle creak of ship masts swaying against the morning tide. Finally, Caesar spoke, his voice low and even. "I understand this much. You do nothing without purpose." Cleopatra met his gaze, her dark eyes reflecting both the sunlight and shadows of the world they inhabited. "And neither do you." With those quiet words, the fragile veil between them seemed to lift, if only for a heartbeat. Here they stood, not as mere sovereign and guest, not as potential lovers, nor as allies of convenience, but as 2 sovereigns, each grasping for a place in the ever-turning wheel of fate. and each, perhaps, seeing in the other a mirror too hauntingly familiar. Their uneasy truce was interrupted by the arrival of a breathless servant. He knelt before them, eyes fixed upon the marble floor, and in trembling hands held a small scroll bound with a simple cord. "My queen," the servant murmured, "a message from the palace gates. The Princess Arsinoe. She requests an audience." Cleopatra's expression did not change, though her hand curled slightly upon the stone rail. She took the scroll with a quiet nod and dismissed the servant with a flick of her hand. Caesar watched as she unfurled the parchment. His sharp eyes caught the faintest flicker of tension across her brow as she read, though her lips remained a serene line. She folded the scroll carefully and turned back toward him. "My sister wishes for a private meeting," Cleopatra said softly. "She claims she desires reconciliation and peace." The words hung between them, delicate and dangerous. "And do you believe her?" Caesar asked, folding his arms across his chest. Cleopatra's gaze drifted toward the distant horizon where the sun cast soft gold upon the water. "Arsinoe desires many things. Peace is not among them." Caesar nodded slowly. "Then why grant her the audience?" Cleopatra met his eyes again, her voice a near whisper. "Because serpents cannot be slain in the dark. They must be drawn into the light." It was later that same day, in the Chamber of Echoes, a vast hall of polished granite and gilded pillars, that Cleopatra met with her sister. Caesar did not attend, though he stood concealed beyond the lattice screens of a side passage, watching with the silent patience of a soldier who knew that the heart of battle often lay in silent words rather than drawn swords. Arsinoe entered the hall draped in soft, green silk, her hair woven with strands of fine gold. She moved with a grace that seemed almost too deliberate, her every step a careful calculation. When she reached the center of the chamber, she inclined her head, a gesture neither deferent nor entirely respectful. "My sister," Arsinoe began, her voice clear and sweet as a bell, "I come without weapons or ill intent. I seek only what is just." Cleopatra remained seated upon a low dais, her hands resting calmly in her lap. "Justice, dear sister, is a word that shifts with the tongue that speaks it." Arsinoe offered a soft smile, tilting her head slightly. "And does not Egypt deserve a queen who will put her people above her personal interests?" A quiet ripple stirred the chamber's air, as though the walls themselves recoiled at the venom beneath the velvet words. Cleopatra did not flinch. "Egypt deserves a queen who will not sell her birthright to foreign blades and silver tongues," Cleopatra replied, her voice smooth as still water. The silence that followed was taut with unspoken truths. From his shadowed vantage point, Caesar watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, noting the subtle play of glances, the barely perceptible shifts in stance. This was a battlefield as dangerous as any legion's front line. It was Arsinoe who spoke next, her voice softer now, almost tender. "Sister, let us not be enemies. Let us stand together. Egypt is vast enough for both of us." Cleopatra smiled then, a smile as gentle and cold as the Nile at winter's dawn. "Egypt belongs to none of us. We belong to Egypt, and Egypt has already chosen." For a heartbeat, Arsinoe's mask slipped, something raw, rage perhaps, flickered across her delicate features. But just as swiftly, she lowered her gaze and curtsied deeply. "As you wish, my queen," she murmured. She turned, her silks whispering against the stone floor, and glided from the chamber without another word. Caesar stepped from the shadows as the echoes of her departure faded. He met Cleopatra's eyes across the stillness of the hall. "You've drawn the serpent into the light," he said quietly. Cleopatra rose slowly, her gaze distant. "Now, we wait for her to strike." Beyond the palace walls, Alexandria breathed on, unaware of the storm gathering beneath its marble skin. And far across the seas, Mark Antony rode through the hills of Greece, a letter unopened in his saddlebag, its seal marked by the emblem of Caesar's household. In dreams and in waking, a silent thread began to pull him southward, toward a fate he could neither foresee nor escape. The triangle was not yet complete, but its shape was beginning to emerge. And in its shadow, the dark truths of love and power stirred, waiting for their hour to rise. The wind shifted over Alexandria in the days that followed, though the sky remained a flawless sheet of blue. It was a change not felt in the air, but in the whispered tones of servants, in the tightened gazes of palace guards, and in the hollow ring of footsteps echoing through the marble corridors. Something unseen had been set in motion. A slow, creeping tension, threading itself between walls once silent with ancient calm. Julius Caesar observed it all with the weary sharpness of a man long accustomed to treachery. In the Senate of Rome, betrayal came wrapped in togas and soft declarations of loyalty. In Alexandria it came in softer forms. Scented letters slipped beneath chamber doors, coins pressed into trembling hands, and glances exchanged across mosaic floors. Here, even the shadows seemed to hold their breath. Cleopatra, for her part, moved through the palace like the silent eye within a gathering storm. Each morning she appeared in the royal courts, her chin held high, her voice firm, her smile serene. But in the quiet hours, when the gold light of the Egyptian dawn filtered through sheer linen curtains, Caesar saw the weight she carried, the invisible mantle of a queen waging a war on the edge of a knife. It was on such a morning, as the harbour bells tolled softly beyond the palace walls, that Caesar entered the queen's private library. The chamber was a haven of papyrus scrolls, bronze astrolabes, and shelves lined with ancient texts bound in cracked leather. Cleopatra stood by the tall window, her slender fingers trailing along the gilded edge of a scroll unfurled before her. Caesar spoke softly, his voice a low hum within the quiet. "Your sister's offer of peace was a lie. You knew this before she even spoke it." Cleopatra did not turn. Of course. He approached, his steps silent upon the inlaid marble. "And yet you let her leave unscathed." A faint smile touched the corner of Cleopatra's lips, though her eyes remained fixed upon the harbour below. A serpent drawn into the open is a serpent easily observed, and sometimes a serpent, when it believes itself unseen, coils closer to its doom. Caesar studied her a moment longer. "You gamble much on her arrogance." Cleopatra turned then, facing him fully. Her gaze was steady, dark and calm. "No more than you gambled when you crossed the Rubicon." For the first time, a smile, small and fleeting, touched Caesar's lips. In her quiet defiance, in her unspoken challenge, he saw a reflection of the hunger that had driven him across 1,000 battlefields. And yet, beneath that reflection lay something else, something deeper. Cleopatra did not seek conquest for glory alone. Her war was one of survival, of reclaiming a kingdom that had been born long before Rome had known its first king. That same day, messengers arrived from the outskirts of the city. Antony had not remained idle. In secret, she had slipped beyond the palace walls, vanishing into the labyrinth of Alexandria's outer quarters. There, among the discontented and the desperate, she wove her own web of allegiance. Mercenaries, street thugs, and disillusioned soldiers gathered beneath her, whispered promises. Silver flowed freely from hands unseen. In taverns and shadowed markets, rumours grew like dark vines, twisting around the roots of the city's heart. The whispers spoke of a queen unfit to rule, a woman who lay in Roman arms while Egypt bled in silence. They spoke of foreign chains and silent assassins. And at the centre of every hushed tale was a name spoken with venom: Cleopatra. In the days that followed, small disturbances stirred the streets of Alexandria. A merchant's cart set ablaze near the palace gates. An officer loyal to Caesar found with his throat slit in an alley where no guards patrolled. A servant boy vanishing after carrying wine to Cleopatra's chamber. Each event, small in itself, was a thread in a growing tapestry of unrest. Yet within the palace, Cleopatra remained composed. She held her daily audiences with poise, accepted the reverence of the court with measured grace, and whispered soft commands to her most loyal attendants beneath the gaze of marble gods. It was in the quiet of the fourth night after Antony's departure that the serpent struck. The attack came not with the clang of swords or the roar of battle, but with a single cry, a servant's scream piercing the silent corridors of the royal wing. Caesar was the first to react. Cloaked only in a simple tunic, he rushed toward the sound, his steps pounding against the marble, the iron tang of instinct sharp upon his tongue. He reached Cleopatra's chambers to find 2 of his Roman guards already engaged in combat. Shadowed figures moved with lethal grace in the half-light, men dressed not as soldiers but as servants, their blades thin and curved like the fangs of desert vipers. One of Caesar's guards fell, a crimson bloom spreading across his chest. Cleopatra stood in the center of the chamber, unarmed, her eyes narrowed but calm. Even as the assassins closed in, she did not retreat. Caesar seized a fallen sword from the floor and moved to her side, his presence a silent shield between queen and death. The fight was swift and brutal. Roman steel met Egyptian blades in a dance of sparks and shadows. Within moments the last assassin fell, his blood staining the ivory tiles at Cleopatra's feet. When the silence returned, broken only by the ragged breath of the surviving guard, Cleopatra met Caesar's eyes with a calm as fierce as any war cry. "Arsinoe," she whispered, her voice steady. "She no longer waits for shadows. She moves now in the open." Caesar lowered his sword slowly, his gaze lingering on the lifeless forms at their feet. "Then we move faster." At dawn, the orders were given. Roman legions stationed near Alexandria marched toward the city's outer quarters. Cleopatra's loyalists, summoned in secret, prepared to reclaim the streets. The serpent's head had shown itself, and now Caesar and Cleopatra would strike. But in the dark chambers of a hidden villa beyond the city's eastern walls, Arsinoe watched the smoke rise from the palace district with eyes like sharpened steel. By her side stood a man whose name history would never record, a shadowed figure from Rome's underworld, once a soldier, now a blade for hire. He leaned toward the young princess, his voice a low hiss. "The Roman fights with swords and soldiers. We fight with whispers and blood." Arsinoe smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the hilt of a slender dagger hidden beneath her robe. "The Roman," she murmured, "fights for power, but I fight for revenge." And even as Caesar and Cleopatra prepared their assault, a darker war had begun. One fought not upon the battlefield, but within the heart of every whispered word, every stolen glance, and every fragile bond yet to be tested. The triangle sharpened, its edges pressed closer, and in its silent center the darkest truths awaited, unseen but stirring, breathing with the slow certainty of fate drawing near. The morning that followed dawned not with golden light, but with a sky smeared in ash and a city murmuring beneath its breath. Alexandria stirred restlessly, like a giant uneasy in its sleep. The streets, once humming with merchants and laughter, had fallen into a tense, watchful silence. In the marketplace, stalls remained shuttered. Along the narrow alleys of the artisan quarters, doors stood half-closed, curious eyes peering from shadowed thresholds. The scent of incense mingled with that of smoke and sweat, a city holding its breath beneath an unseen blade. Within the palace, Julius Caesar stood over a large bronze table in the war chamber, his hands resting firmly on the etched surface. A map of Alexandria lay spread before him, pins marking the key districts where unrest had begun to fester like an untreated wound. Around him gathered a small circle of Roman officers and a select few Egyptian nobles loyal to Cleopatra. Their voices murmured softly, words clipped with urgency but veiled in caution. Cleopatra entered the chamber without ceremony, her presence shifting the air as though the Nile itself had changed course. She wore no crown, no gilded necklace, only a simple robe of deep amethyst silk that clung to her frame like a whisper. Her dark hair fell loose over her shoulders, the faintest scent of myrrh lingering in her wake. The men fell silent as she approached. Caesar lifted his gaze to meet hers, and in that brief exchange no words were needed. The bond they shared, forged in the quiet crucible of mutual ambition and whispered confidences, now stood tempered by blood and steel. Cleopatra moved beside him, her eyes sweeping over the map. Her fingers, slender and pale, hovered above a pin marking the eastern quarter of the city, where the heart of the unrest now pulsed like a darkened vein. "She has gathered them there," Cleopatra murmured, her voice low and sure. "The discontented, the desperate, those easily swayed by promises they do not understand." One of the Roman officers, a broad man with scars marking his weathered face, spoke gruffly. "If we strike now, we can crush them before the rebellion spreads." Caesar's gaze remained fixed on the map, his expression unreadable. "Strike too soon and we drive the unrest deeper into the shadows. Like smoke, it will slip through the cracks of the city and rise again." Cleopatra's eyes met his, her voice soft but edged with iron. "But wait too long, and the flames will reach the palace walls." For a long moment the chamber held its breath. Then Caesar straightened, his hand curling into a fist atop the bronze table. "We strike, but not with legions. Not yet." He turned his gaze toward the nobles gathered near the chamber's edge, men whose loyalty to Cleopatra bound them in ways Roman coin never could. "We send envoys," Caesar continued, his voice firm. Trusted men who will move through the city's veins. They will offer amnesty to those willing to lay down arms, and they will carry a warning to those who refuse." A murmur of approval stirred among the Egyptians, though beneath it lay an undercurrent of doubt, a wariness born of knowing Alexandria's heart better than any foreign general could. Cleopatra nodded slowly. "And if Arsinoe refuses the offer of peace?" Caesar's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we remind her, Rome does not offer twice." The plan was simple in its brilliance, a net cast wide enough to ensnare the wavering hearts of Alexandria's citizens, yet leaving space enough for the boldest enemies to reveal themselves. The legions would remain at the ready, stationed discreetly in the palace district, their presence felt but unseen. Meanwhile, Cleopatra's loyalists would move among the people, bearing both olive branch and dagger. But war, as Caesar well knew, was never a matter of plans alone. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon in hues of crimson and bronze, Cleopatra sat alone in the Queen's garden, a sanctuary of cypress trees and lotus blossoms veiled in fragrant shadows. The air hummed softly with the song of distant lyres, a sound drifting from unseen courtyards where minstrels played for gods and ghosts alike. It was there that Caesar found her, standing by a pool of still water that reflected the bruised sky above. He approached without a word, his footsteps soft upon the stone path. Cleopatra did not turn. "Do you think this will end as you hope, Julius?" His voice was quiet when he spoke. "Hope is for men who believe they can bargain with fate." A faint smile touched her lips, though her eyes remained on the mirrored sky in the pool. "And do you?" He stepped beside her, his reflection joining hers in the silent water. "I have bargained with fate all my life. It has never once kept its end of the bargain." At that, Cleopatra did turn, her gaze lifting to meet his. The fading light cast soft shadows upon her face, etching the sharp lines of her cheekbones, the quiet strength of her jaw. Yet in her eyes, Caesar saw a glimmer not of fear, but of something far deeper. An understanding of the cost of power, a cost both of them had long accepted. "You once said," she whispered, "that a man who dares to defy Rome's Senate fears no king nor queen." A soft chuckle escaped Caesar's lips. "And you, Cleopatra, have taught me to fear neither, but to respect both." Their eyes held for a long, silent moment, two sovereigns standing at the edge of a war neither could fully control. And beneath the surface of their words, something unspoken stirred. A bond neither mere alliance nor simple desire. A bond forged by the dark weight of understanding. But even as they stood together in the quiet hush of the Queen's garden, the city beyond the palace walls continued its restless murmur. In the heart of the eastern quarter, Arsinoe gathered her followers beneath the shadowed arches of an abandoned temple. With her stood the man known only by whispered rumor, a Roman exile turned mercenary, his blade sharp as his treachery. "You will send the message?" Arsinoe asked, her voice a soft coil of silk and venom. The mercenary nodded, slipping a folded parchment into the sleeve of his tunic. "By dawn, it will reach Caesar's hand." Arsinoe smiled, a smile that held no warmth. "Good, then let him know. The serpent has no fear of the eagle." Beyond the walls of Alexandria, a ship cut silently through the night waters, bearing a letter sealed with the mark of Caesar himself, a letter bound for Greece, for the hand of Mark Antony. And thus, beneath a sky of quiet fire, the triangle's edges drew closer still, not with the roar of war, but with the softest whisper of betrayal. And in that whisper, the dark truth stirred, waiting, patient as death itself. The letter reached Mark Antony as the summer sun hung heavy over the hills of northern Greece. He had been encamped with his cohorts near the city of Dyrrhachium, overseeing the mustering of legions loyal to Caesar's cause. The camp sprawled like a restless beast along the banks of a slow, winding river. Roman standards fluttered lazily in the dry breeze, the crimson cloth stained with dust from weeks of unrelenting drills and marches. It was near dusk when the messenger arrived, an Egyptian courier, thin and silent, bearing a single scroll wrapped in dark silk. Antony had been sharpening his sword beneath the stretched canvas of his command tent when the man was led in by 2 Roman guards. Without a word, the courier bowed deeply and extended the letter with trembling hands. Mark Antony dismissed the guards with a glance. As they stepped outside, he took the scroll, feeling the weight of the seal, an unmistakable emblem pressed into softened wax, the intertwined sigils of Caesar's household and the royal house of Egypt. He broke the seal with his thumb and read. The letter was brief, written in Caesar's hand, but its meaning struck deeper than any imperial decree. The Queen of Egypt has drawn serpents from their holes. I stand with her in a game none of us may yet understand. Come swiftly, bring men you trust. The hour of delicate war approaches. There was no signature. There was no need for one. For a long moment, Antony stared at the words, the low hum of the evening wind pressing softly against the tense canvas. The camp beyond stirred with the quiet sounds of soldiers preparing for the night, voices murmuring, armor clinking, the soft hiss of steel sliding against whetstone. Yet within Antony's tent, a silence stretched thin and taut as a drawn bowstring. Cleopatra. He had heard her name before, whispered with a mixture of awe and suspicion among Caesar's closest circles. Tales of her beauty, her cunning, her strange, beguiling power had reached even the furthest outposts of the Republic. But it was not the allure of an exotic queen that stirred something restless within Mark Antony now. It was something far more ancient, the echo of destiny's hand reaching quietly across the seas. He had served Caesar faithfully for years, marching in the shadow of the man whose boldness had defied a senate grown fat with fear and pride. But even in loyalty, Antony had known a secret hunger, the desire not merely to serve history but to stand at its center. And now it seemed history itself was beckoning him southward toward Alexandria, toward Cleopatra. That night, beneath the pale watch of the moon, Mark Antony summoned his most trusted officers, men bound not by titles, but by battles shared in the mud and blood of Rome's forgotten wars. They gathered in a quiet circle beyond the flickering firelight of the main camp. "We sail before dawn," Antony told them, his voice low but firm. "The command falls to you in my absence. Hold this ground, await further orders from Caesar himself." The men exchanged brief glances, but offered no protest. They knew better than most that questions served little purpose when fate called. One of them, a veteran named Lucius, stepped forward, his expression marked with curiosity more than concern. "Where do you sail, sir?" Antony met his gaze, a faint smile curling the edge of his lips. "To a city of whispers and a queen of shadows." Before dawn, Antony slipped away with a small retinue, a mere handful of men and 2 swift triremes slicing southward across the Ionian Sea. As the sails caught the rising wind, the first pale blush of morning touched the water's surface, gilding the waves in soft gold. For days they sailed beneath a sky of endless azure, the sea a mirror to the heavens above. Yet as they neared the coast of Egypt, the wind seemed to change, cooler, laden with a scent Antony could neither name nor forget. A scent of ancient things, of time itself watching from beyond the horizon. Alexandria welcomed them not with trumpets nor banners, but with silence. When Antony stepped onto the polished stone of the royal harbour, Caesar himself awaited him. The Roman leader stood clad not in the armour of a general, but in the plain robes of a dignitary. A subtle message, perhaps, or merely the choice of a man playing a careful hand in a delicate game. The 2 men clasped hands in a silent greeting. No words passed between them for a long moment, just a quiet acknowledgement of battles fought, of fates intertwined. "It is worse than I imagined," Antony said finally, his eyes scanning the harbour where Roman soldiers lingered like shadows among Egyptian guards. Caesar nodded. "The city waits, as all serpents do." They walked side by side toward the palace, their steps echoing softly against the marble causeways. And as they passed beneath the looming arches of Alexandria's ancient gates, Antony felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him, eyes that watched from behind silk-draped balconies, from shaded alcoves, from the shadows that clung to every stone. But it was within the palace that Antony first beheld the woman whose name had haunted the corridors of Rome. Cleopatra entered the hall as the sun dipped low beyond the western towers, casting the chamber in a warm amber glow. She moved with a grace that defied explanation, neither hurried nor hesitant, her presence a quiet command that bent the air around her. For a fleeting heartbeat, Antony understood what legends could never convey. She was not merely beautiful, though her beauty was undeniable. She was present, utterly and entirely, in a way few ever were. Her eyes, deep as obsidian pools, held a knowledge both ancient and intimate, as if she saw not just the man before her, but the threads of fate trailing behind him. They stood facing each other across the great marble floor. Antony, the soldier hardened by years of campaign, and Cleopatra, the queen whose kingdom balanced upon a knife's edge. "It seems," Cleopatra said softly, her voice a quiet echo in the vastness of the chamber, "that Rome sends not its armies, but its heart." A faint smile touched Antony's lips. "Rome's heart," he murmured, "is a treacherous thing." Cleopatra met his gaze, her eyes dark with a depth Antony could not yet fathom. Then perhaps it has met its match. In that quiet exchange, something unseen stirred, a thread drawn tight between two fates yet to collide. Behind them, Caesar watched with a gaze sharp as a blade, his thoughts hidden beneath the calm mask of a seasoned leader. And though no words marked the moment, he knew, with the certainty of a man who had faced both gods and emperors, that the triangle had begun to close. Not with a clash of swords, but with the silent touch of glances and the soft, inevitable whisper of destiny. Night fell over Alexandria, draping the city in shadows, and beneath those shadows the dark truth waited, patient, silent, and ever drawing closer. Night unfurled its velvet wings over Alexandria, with a hush so profound it seemed the city itself exhaled in uneasy slumber. The harbour lights flickered upon the restless waves, casting golden glimmers that swayed and shimmered like wandering spirits. Within the royal palace, where marble walls bore witness to centuries of whispered intrigues, a gathering unfolded, quiet, careful, and wrapped in the delicate silk of unspoken alliances. The banquet had been Cleopatra's idea. A private feast within the Queen's pavilion, a hall known not for its grandeur but for its intimacy. Only a select few attended: Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, a handful of trusted Roman officers, and the Queen's closest advisors. The air within the chamber shimmered with the faint perfume of lotus blossoms and the soft hum of lyres plucked by unseen musicians behind linen drapes. Cleopatra sat at the head of the low dining table, reclining upon silken cushions, her presence weaving effortlessly into the flow of conversation. She spoke little, yet every glance, every word, every delicate gesture of her hand drew attention as surely as the pull of a distant tide. Caesar observed her with the keen eyes of a statesman, his expression calm, his mind moving swiftly behind a mask of composed interest. Mark Antony, by contrast, watched her with something different, a curiosity sharpened by instinct, a soldier's appraisal laced with the faintest ember of something more dangerous. He listened as she spoke of Alexandria's long history, of the pharaohs who built empires upon the Nile's shifting banks, of gods who walked among mortals in the days before Rome had drawn its first breath. "Egypt," Cleopatra said softly, her voice a melodic murmur, "is a land that remembers. Long after kings fall and empires fade, Egypt remembers." Antony raised his goblet slightly, a faint smile curling at the edge of his lips. "And Rome forgets." Cleopatra's gaze met his across the flickering candlelight. "Then perhaps we are opposites drawn to the same fate." The words hung in the air, delicate as spun glass. Around them, the conversation softened into a lull, the musicians' gentle melodies weaving between shadows and whispers. Caesar's eyes flicked briefly toward Antony, though no words passed his lips. A subtle glance, quick as a blade's flash, and in that silent glance, something deeper stirred. The banquet wore on into the later hours, though no revelry marked its course. It was not a night for laughter, nor drunken boasts. It was a night of quiet exchanges, of measured words and glances sharpened by the knowledge that within this chamber lay the delicate balance of empires. When the gathering finally dissolved, the guests departing with soft farewells and careful bows, Antony remained seated beside the low-burning brazier near the pavilion's entrance. His thoughts moved like slow embers, each one casting shadows deeper than the last. Cleopatra approached him then, her steps silent against the mosaic floor. She did not sit, nor did she speak at first, only stood, watching him with a gaze that seemed both near and impossibly distant. "You wonder," she said at last, her voice scarcely above a whisper, "why you were summoned to Alexandria." Antony met her gaze without flinching. "Caesar called, I came." A faint smile touched her lips. "Caesar called, but I asked." He frowned slightly, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "You?" Cleopatra's hands folded before her, slender fingers entwining in a gesture more thoughtful than formal. "Rome sends soldiers, but Egypt needs more than swords. It needs hearts, minds. those who understand that empires are not built on conquest alone. Antony tilted his head, his gaze narrowing. And what is it you think I understand, my queen? Cleopatra stepped closer, the faintest scent of jasmine rising with her. That loyalty is a fragile coin, and even the boldest heart can be bought, not with gold, but with purpose. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Antony set his goblet aside, rising slowly to stand before her. And what purpose do you offer, Cleopatra? She met his gaze without wavering, one that will outlive both Rome and Egypt. Her words, soft as they were, struck Antony with a force he had not expected. He had seen ambition, burning, reckless, selfish, but what shone in Cleopatra's eyes was something else, a vision deeper than thrones and banners, a vision of legacy, of power entwined with destiny itself. Before he could speak, a shadow moved at the chamber's far end. Caesar stepped into view, his face unreadable, his presence quiet but commanding. For a moment, all three stood in a triangle of silent understanding, each bound to the other by threads unseen, each carrying within them a purpose the others could only guess. Caesar's gaze lingered on Antony, then shifted to Cleopatra. "The time for words ends," Caesar said softly. "Alexandria stirs, Arsinoe moves, the city watches and waits." Cleopatra inclined her head, her expression serene. "Then let it watch and see who truly holds its heart." Without another word, she turned and slipped into the shadows beyond the pavilion's pillars, her silken robes trailing like whispers upon the floor. Antony watched her go, a slow breath filling his chest. When he turned back, Caesar stood beside him, his eyes reflecting something sharp, and perhaps beneath it, a faint glimmer of warning. "She is unlike any I have known," Antony said quietly. Caesar gave a soft, humorless smile. "And unlike any you will ever know again." They stood in silence a moment longer before Caesar placed a hand briefly upon Antony's shoulder, a gesture of comradeship, but also of caution. "The heart is a dangerous thing to wager," Caesar murmured. And with that, he too turned and walked into the night. Antony remained alone, staring into the embers of the dying brazier. Beyond the palace walls, Alexandria slept fitfully beneath a sky thick with unseen stars. But within its silent heart, a game more perilous than any war began to weave its dark threads. The triangle drew tighter, and beneath its elegant lines, betrayal stirred softly, unseen, inevitable. Morning broke over Alexandria with a brittle light, the sun rising pale and sharp as a honed blade. The streets remained hushed, the hum of daily life subdued beneath the weight of unseen tensions. Markets opened with caution, vendors speaking in soft tones, glancing often over their shoulders. Sailors in the harbour loaded ships with a watchful eye toward the palace, as if the tides themselves waited on some silent command. Within the marble heart of the royal residence, Julius Caesar sat in the war chamber once more. A scroll lay open before him, its words inked in a hand he recognized, a message from his spies embedded deep within the city's eastern quarter. He read slowly, the meaning of each word sinking like stones into the stillness of the chamber. Arsinoe's rebellion had grown bolder overnight. Small groups of armed men, drawn from Alexandria's poorest districts and the fringes of mercenary companies, had begun seizing control of supply routes into the city. Grain shipments vanished before reaching the palace. Roman patrols found themselves harried by unseen hands in the crowded alleys. Whispers of an impending uprising hummed through the marketplaces, carried on the lips of beggars and nobles alike. Cleopatra entered the chamber without announcement, as had become her custom. She moved with quiet authority, her gown of deep green trailing softly against the marble. The faint scent of papyrus and honey followed her, a reminder of her dominion over both knowledge and power. Caesar did not look up at once. Instead, he traced a finger along a single name inked upon the scroll's edge, Arsinoe. "She moves faster than expected," Caesar murmured. Cleopatra approached the table, her eyes scanning the message. "She moves like a child who believes herself unseen, until the torchlight reveals her hand." Caesar finally met her gaze. Children with torches have burned kingdoms before. Cleopatra's lips curved slightly, though no warmth touched her expression. Not this one. There was no arrogance in her voice, only a quiet certainty born of bloodlines that stretched beyond the memory of Rome itself. Yet even that certainty did not blind her to the peril that darkened Alexandria's streets. Caesar leaned back, folding the scroll with deliberate care. The people love you, Cleopatra, but they fear hunger more, and Arsinoe offers promises that sound sweeter than truth. Cleopatra's eyes darkened slightly. Then we show them a truth they cannot deny. Caesar tilted his head. And what truth is that? She drew a slow breath, her gaze drifting toward the tall windows where the city's skyline shimmered beneath the morning sun. That Egypt stands unbroken, that her queen fears nothing and no one. The hours that followed moved with quiet, surgical precision. Messengers were dispatched under Cleopatra's seal, runners swift and silent, carrying her command to every loyal district and guard post. Roman officers moved through the palace, issuing orders drawn not from fear, but from strategy honed in countless campaigns. At midday, as the sun blazed high over Alexandria's domes and minarets, Cleopatra ascended the grand balcony of the palace, the first time since Caesar's arrival that she had shown herself so openly before the people. The square below, once a place of bustling trade and the vibrant pulse of city life, now stood hushed and watchful. Crowds gathered in cautious clusters, their eyes drawn upward to the figure who emerged upon the sunlit marble. Cleopatra stood alone, without retinue or guard. She wore no crown, only a simple robe of white linen, the gold clasp at her shoulder bearing the emblem of her house, a lotus entwined with the eye of Horus. She raised her hand and the murmurs stilled. Her voice, when it came, carried clear and strong across the hushed square. "People of Alexandria, children of the Nile, hear me." The words fell like gentle rain upon parched earth. The crowd, drawn by curiosity, leaned closer, ears straining. "I do not stand before you as a queen who hides behind foreign swords. I stand as a daughter of Egypt, born upon its sands, sworn to its gods, bound to its fate." A murmur stirred, low and uncertain. "I have walked among you in days of peace, and I walk among you still, in this hour of unrest. Let no serpent's whisper deceive you, no false promise sway your hearts, for I have sworn by the blood of my fathers, Egypt will not fall." The silence that followed hung heavy, fragile as glass. Then a single voice rang out from the crowd, a woman's voice, trembling but loud. "Long live the Queen!" Another voice joined, then another, and another. In moments the square rippled with a chorus rising like the swell of the Nile, soft at first, then stronger, louder, until the air itself seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of a people awakened. Long live the Queen! From his place within the palace's upper chamber, Mark Antony watched the scene unfold. He stood beside Caesar, both men silent, their eyes fixed upon the figure standing radiant against the sun's golden blaze. "She commands them without lifting a sword," Antony murmured. Caesar's gaze remained steady. The greatest battles are won before the first blow is struck. Yet even as they spoke, a shadow moved beneath Alexandria's streets, a darker current flowing beneath the surface of newfound loyalty. Arsinoe, hidden in the labyrinthine corridors of the city's eastern quarter, received the news with a faint, venomous smile. Around her, mercenaries and cutthroats leaned over a map of the city scrawled upon cracked parchment. "So the serpent bears her fangs before the crowd," Arsinoe murmured. "Let her." The mercenary at her side, a man with eyes like polished stone, spoke softly. "They chant her name now." Arsinoe's fingers traced a slow, deliberate path across the map to a marked point near the palace walls. "They chant today," she whispered. "Tomorrow, they will burn." And in the darkness of her plans, a plot began to weave. A strike not upon Cleopatra herself, but upon the heart of her newfound power. A single blow, swift and ruthless, that would shatter the fragile unity rising in the city's heart. As night fell once more over Alexandria, the city rested in uneasy calm, a lull heavy with unseen currents. And within the web of silent glances and whispered plots, the triangle drew ever closer to its sharpest edge. Love, power, betrayal, three hearts bound in a fate none could escape, and in their shadows the dark truth stirred, its moment approaching with the slow, inevitable pull of the tide. Night fell with deceptive gentleness upon Alexandria. The city, bathed in the soft glow of oil lamps and silver starlight, seemed almost peaceful, its harbour rocking lazily with the rhythm of anchored ships, its streets muffled beneath the quiet hum of evening prayers and drifting laughter from shaded taverns. Yet beneath that fragile veneer, unrest coiled tighter with every passing hour. Within the eastern quarter, hidden among a web of narrow alleys and sunken courtyards, Arsinoe's faction stirred in whispered urgency. In a modest villa, Stripped of royal ornament and fortified by armed mercenaries, she sat at the head of a long, low table, surrounded by faces marked more by hunger than by loyalty. Hired blades, disgruntled nobles, and men of uncertain allegiance leaned in, their eyes sharp with expectation. Arsinoe's voice, soft and cold, cut through the murmuring chamber. The people may chant her name today, but tomorrow they will chant mine. The mercenary captain, an aging Roman exile known only as Septimus, shifted slightly in his chair. A speech will not crumble a queen, he murmured. Arsinoe's lips curved in a smile without warmth. No, but a fire might. A murmur stirred among the gathered men, some shifting uncomfortably. Septimus folded his arms across his chest, his expression hardening. A riot is one thing, but burning the grain stores? That would starve the city, starve even your own supporters. Arsinoe's eyes fixed upon him, dark and unwavering. And in starvation the people will turn against her. They will beg for a new ruler, one who promises food over pretty words. The plan was simple in its cruelty. Under cover of darkness, selected men would ignite the grain warehouses lining the docks of the Western Quarter, the vital supply chain that fed Alexandria's teeming masses. Fear, hunger, and rage would ripple through the city before dawn. And when panic set in, Arsinoe would present herself not as a rebel, but as a savior bearing the keys to hidden storehouses stocked beyond the queen's reach. Septimus held her gaze a moment longer before inclining his head. As you command. Outside, in the twisting streets of Alexandria, her men slipped away like shadows, each carrying within them a spark that could ignite a kingdom's fall. Within the palace, oblivious to the precise nature of Arsinoe's design, but wary of her hand in the growing unrest, Caesar and Antony prepared for contingencies. Together, they walked the dim corridors of the palace's western wing, their conversation a low murmur beneath the soft glow of torchlight. She moves with a serpent's patience, Antony observed, his voice edged with quiet frustration. A direct confrontation would settle this. Caesar's expression remained calm, his hands clasped behind his back. Arsinoe thrives on shadows. If we drag her into the open too soon, she will slip through our grasp, and perhaps take half the city with her. Antony gave a low, humorless chuckle. And you trust this city's loyalty to Cleopatra will hold? Caesar glanced toward him, a faint smile touching his lips. I trust that men will choose bread over whispers. But even as he spoke, both men knew how fragile the line between loyalty and desperation could be. They turned a corner into a quiet courtyard, a moonlit square framed by slender columns. There, beneath the soft rustle of palm fronds, Cleopatra stood alone, her gaze lifted toward the dark expanse of the sky. Antony felt a strange stillness settle within him at the sight of her. She wore a simple robe of indigo silk, the hem brushing the stone beneath her bare feet. Her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, a single silver band encircling her brow. She looked neither queen nor captive, simply a woman standing on the edge of a gathering storm. Caesar spoke first, his voice quiet. The city sleeps, but not for long. Cleopatra turned to face them, her expression unreadable. I know. Antony stepped forward, folding his arms across his chest. There are rumors of unrest near the docks. Men gathering, whispers of violence. Cleopatra met his gaze steadily. There are always whispers in Alexandria, but whispers grow louder when fed by fear. Her words hung in the air, soft but heavy with meaning. Caesar moved to stand beside her, his tone measured. What will you do if the people turn against you? Cleopatra's gaze drifted past him, toward the faint lights flickering in the city beyond. Then I will remind them who I am. Her voice carried a quiet force that sent a subtle shiver through Antony's spine. In her calm defiance, in her unwavering certainty, he glimpsed the raw, undiluted core of power, not the brittle strength of a ruler clinging to a throne, but the quiet resilience of a sovereign who had weathered storms deeper and darker than this. For a long moment, none spoke. Then Caesar placed a hand gently on Cleopatra's shoulder, a rare gesture of shared burden, perhaps even of trust. We stand with you. Cleopatra inclined her head, her expression softening slightly. And I with you. Yet even as they stood together in the moonlit courtyard, a quiet flicker ignited in the darkened docks of Alexandria. A single torch, a spark carried on a silent wind, and then the soft, hungry whisper of flames. It began with one warehouse, the smallest of the grain stores. a bloom of fire that licked hungrily at the sky before anyone noticed. But fire, once freed, cares nothing for politics or loyalties. By the time the guards raised the alarm, 2 more warehouses stood ablaze, the heat radiating in shimmering waves across the western quarter. Cries pierced the night, shouts of panic, of desperate attempts to douse the spreading inferno. And in the heart of the palace, the sound reached Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra as a distant echo, a herald of the chaos unfurling beyond the marble walls. Cleopatra's eyes darkened, though her voice remained calm. It begins. Antony turned sharply towards Caesar, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. We must move. If this spreads, the city will riot before dawn. Caesar nodded once, already issuing quiet commands to the nearest guard. Within moments, runners were dispatched, orders sharp and swift. Secure the docks, protect the remaining grain stores, contain the flames. But as the First Legion surged toward the western quarter, a darker realization settled upon the hearts of those gathered within the palace. This was no mere act of rebellion. It was a declaration, a silent, burning message scrawled across the night sky of Alexandria. And in its searing light, the delicate balance between queen, conqueror, and soldier would tilt, perhaps beyond saving. The triangle tightened, its edges drawn sharper by fire and fear, and within its narrowing embrace, the darkest truth began its slow, relentless rise, silent as smoke and just as inescapable. The summer heat pressed heavily over Alexandria, as if the sun itself conspired to slow the world's breath. The Nile rolled sluggish and green, shimmering under the torpid sky, while the whitewashed columns of the royal palace gleamed like silent witnesses to secrets no one dared utter aloud. Within the labyrinthine corridors of Cleopatra's private chambers, a quiet unease simmered beneath the veneer of luxury. Golden censers swung gently, releasing wisps of sweet myrrh and lotus oil, yet the perfumed air could not mask the cold tension coiling in every shadowed alcove. Mark Antony stood alone at the edge of an open balcony, his broad shoulders casting a dark silhouette against the fading light. He gripped the marble rail tightly, as though holding back a storm within himself. The faint hum of the city drifted upward, the cries of merchants, the music of distant flutes, and the ever-present murmur of the harbour. But Antony heard none of it. His heart thundered with a different sound, the silent echo of betrayal. Just days before, in a secluded garden lit by lanterns swaying in the sea breeze, a conversation had unfolded that now burned in his mind like a fever dream. A Roman merchant, nameless and cautious, had whispered truths too dangerous to speak openly. The man, hands trembling, had claimed that Caesar himself, long dead in the Senate's Hall of Daggers, had once harboured a plan far darker than mere conquest of Egypt. It was said that Caesar, enamoured by Cleopatra's beauty and intellect, had sought not only her throne but her entire bloodline for his control. According to the merchant, Caesar's union with the Egyptian queen had been forged not from love but from a cold calculation to ensure that the divine blood of the Ptolemies would be absorbed into Roman power, Rome's ultimate insurance of Eastern dominion. And Mark Antony, the loyal friend of Caesar, had been meant to play the part of the second tether, a living leash to Cleopatra's heart should Caesar fall. The words had clawed at Antony's heart, filling him with a corrosive doubt he could not shake. Was he, too, merely a pawn in Caesar's grand design? Had Cleopatra's affections been genuine, or had she simply continued the subtle game of empire, shifting from one Roman hand to the next? Inside the chamber, Cleopatra lay reclined upon a divan of soft linen and woven gold thread. Her face, serene and distant, betrayed nothing of the storm Antony wrestled with in the shadows. She spoke softly, her voice low like the murmur of reeds in the wind. "You are troubled," she said, eyes half-lidded as if watching a vision only she could see. "Your silence wraps around you like the Nile's mist. Will you not unburden yourself?" Antony turned to her, his jaw tight. He crossed the mosaic floor with the slow deliberation of a man approaching both lover and adversary. "Tell me," he began, his voice hoarse, "when Caesar first came to you, what did you see in him? Was it love, or a pact of power?" A flicker of something, too fleeting to name, crossed Cleopatra's face. She folded her slender hands upon her lap, nails glinting with a lacquer of crushed rubies. "Love," she whispered, "is a veil woven with many threads. Power, ambition, desire, protection, they are all part of the tapestry. Antony's heart clenched. The words hung between them, soft as a lover's sigh, yet sharp as a blade. "And what of me?" he pressed, stepping closer, his voice lowering into a near growl. "Am I but another thread in your veil?" Cleopatra met his gaze with a calmness that defied comprehension. Her eyes, deep as the endless Nile, held no fear. "You were the thread I did not expect," she said, "the one not woven by Caesar's hand." Antony searched her face, seeking some trace of deceit, but found none. And yet, the doubt gnawed at him still, a silent serpent coiled around his heart. That night, sleep evaded him. As Alexandria drifted into dreams, Antony walked alone through the moonlit gardens of the palace. The scent of jasmine mingled with the salt of the sea, but nothing soothed the fire in his chest. The whisper of the Roman merchant echoed again and again in his ears. If Caesar had planned to make Egypt a silent tributary through the bonds of love, what was left of true affection? Could any bond with Cleopatra be pure, or was it forever tainted by the ghost of Caesar's ambition? At the heart of the garden stood a statue of Osiris, lord of the underworld, his arms crossed in eternal judgment. Antony stood before it, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon him. A soft voice broke the night's hush. "Even Osiris cannot judge the heart's truth." Antony turned sharply. Cleopatra stood behind him, wrapped in a cloak of white silk that caught the moonlight like a shroud. Her expression was unreadable, yet her presence was undeniable. "You followed me," he said quietly. "I have always followed you," she replied, stepping closer, "even when you thought you walked alone." A long silence stretched between them. Then Cleopatra reached out, her fingers grazing Antony's hand. "I do not know what Caesar intended," she murmured, her gaze unwavering. "Perhaps he sought to bind me as he did all the world. But I do know this. You are the first man I chose for myself." Antony stared at her, the storm within him softening yet not dispersing. Her words were soft, sincere, yet the shadows of doubt lingered like a phantom at his side. "Is it enough," he asked quietly, "to be the man you chose after him?" Cleopatra's eyes shimmered, reflecting the pale light. "Only you can answer that." The night closed around them, thick with unspoken fears and fragile hopes. In that moment, between the living and the memory of the dead, Antony felt a quiet truth settle within him. A truth that would haunt him as surely as Caesar's ghost. The darkness in their triangle of power was not merely in betrayal or ambition, but in the fragile threads of love itself. Threads stretched between power, legacy, and the aching desire to be chosen not as a pawn, but as a man worthy of a queen's heart. And in the silent shadows of Alexandria, that dark truth began its slow, inexorable weave into the fate of empires. The dawn arrived softly over Alexandria, casting gentle hues of gold and rose across the city's domes and slender minarets. The palace stirred with the quiet rustling of servants, the distant chiming of bronze bells, and the soft sweep of sandals over marble. But within the royal chambers, Mark Antony remained wrapped in a wakeful silence, sitting upon a cushioned bench near the window where the morning light fell in slanted beams. His hands rested upon his knees, calloused fingers woven together, as if holding the weight of unspoken thoughts. He had not slept. The whispered fears planted in the depths of his heart refused to fade with the coming light. They grew instead, taking root in the fertile soil of suspicion and pride. Even Cleopatra's tender words beneath the silver gaze of the moon lingered with a haunting ambiguity, comforting yet incomplete. For in the theatre of power, where love and loyalty crossed swords with ambition, even the sweetest words could be laced with silent calculation. As the city awoke, a visitor arrived at the palace gates, a man known neither to the court nor to the generals of Rome. He was a scholar of minor renown, a keeper of obscure histories, summoned at the queen's behest. His name was Philostratus, a Greek from Rhodes, whose knowledge of royal bloodlines and ancient treaties ran as deep as the roots of the old empires. With a thin frame draped in simple robes, he moved with the quiet humility of one accustomed to observing rather than being observed. Philostratus entered the chamber with a respectful bow, his eyes lowered, his hands empty of scroll or token. Cleopatra received him in a smaller audience hall, a chamber of soft draperies and carved ivory, where only the softest whispers of courtly intrigue dared enter. "I have summoned you," Cleopatra said softly, reclining upon a couch of Tyrian purple. Because I seek knowledge that lies beyond the reach of Roman blades and Egyptian charms. Philostratus inclined his head. I am at your command, my queen. Cleopatra's gaze, sharp as the glint of sunlight on steel, fixed upon the scholar. Tell me, what is recorded in the annals of Rhodes regarding Julius Caesar's private dealings with Egypt before and after his arrival? The scholar's expression did not change, though his shoulders tensed slightly, a mere breath of movement. There are fragments, he said. Letters of correspondence, accounts by traders, and the testimony of those who served in embassies. They speak of Caesar's interest in the East, an interest deeper than war or tribute. Cleopatra leaned forward, her voice a mere whisper. Go on. It is said, Philostratus continued, that long before Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he consulted with seers and philosophers. They warned him of the dangers of holding the West without the East. They whispered of an ancient prophecy, that the ruler who united the eagle of Rome with the crown of the Nile would command a reign beyond mortal kings. A chill traced the edge of Cleopatra's spine, though her expression remained placid. And so, Philostratus added, Caesar set his eyes upon Egypt, not merely as a conquest, but as a keystone to an empire of destiny. His union with you, it is whispered, was meant as a sacred binding, a ritual as much as a political bond. Cleopatra exhaled slowly, her fingers resting upon the amethyst pendant at her throat. And Mark Antony? She asked, her voice low. Philostratus hesitated. There are darker whispers. That Caesar, foreseeing his own peril in Rome, intended for Antony to stand as the second guardian of this Eastern bond, not as your lover, but as your keeper, a silent sentinel of Roman interest, a safeguard against your heart's defiance. The words fell like a shroud across the chamber, drawing the very air into a hush. Cleopatra's eyes narrowed slightly, reflecting the depths of the Nile itself, dark, unknowable, yet treacherous beneath a glassy surface. Did Caesar speak of this to Antony? She asked softly. Philostratus shook his head. There is no record of such. If he did, it died with him in the Senate's hall. Cleopatra dismissed the scholar with a flick of her slender hand, her mind weaving a tapestry of unspoken fears and tangled desires. The soft sound of his retreating footsteps faded, leaving only the sigh of the wind through the silk-hung windows. When Mark Antony entered the chamber later that morning, summoned by Cleopatra's quiet request, he found her standing alone by a carved pillar, her form silhouetted against the soft blaze of morning. The air between them felt dense with unshed words. You sought the counsel of a scholar, Antony said, his voice measured. Cleopatra turned slowly, her gaze unreadable. I did. And what did he tell you? Antony asked, stepping closer, though a fragile distance remained between them. Cleopatra held his gaze for a long, breathless moment. He spoke of Caesar's designs, and of a prophecy that bound the fate of Egypt to the ambitions of Rome. Antony's eyes darkened. Did he speak of me? He did, she replied, her voice soft yet steady. Of how you were meant to be, my keeper. A muscle twitched in Antony's jaw. His hands curled into slow fists at his sides. And is that how you see me? Cleopatra stepped forward, her bare feet silent upon the cool marble. She reached for his hand, her touch light, trembling at the edges of certainty. I see you, she whispered, as the man who broke the design of fate, the man who chose me, and whom I chose in return. The softness in her voice cut deeper than any blade. Antony stared down at their joined hands, torn between the storm of anger and the aching pull of her truth. But even as he clasped her hand, he knew. The shadow of Caesar's intentions lay like a veil between them, a dark thread woven into every glance, every touch, every whispered vow. And though their hearts beat in desperate tandem, the quiet spectre of betrayal began its silent march, a ghost neither love nor loyalty could wholly banish. The summer deepened in Alexandria, its air growing heavy with the scent of sun-warmed stone, ripened figs, and the lingering perfume of sea breezes curling over marble balustrades. Yet within the heart of the royal palace, a strange coolness settled, a hushed stillness between Cleopatra and Mark Antony that no gilded banquet or whispered vow could seem to dispel. The days unfolded in a ritual of shared duties and glances half averted, a dance upon the edge of something both fragile and perilous. Antony began to watch the court with sharper eyes. The soft laughter of courtiers, the faint nods between advisers, the ripple of veiled glances exchanged in shadowed corridors, Each seemed suddenly laced with hidden meaning. He saw plots where perhaps there were none, and in the spaces between truth and suspicion, his heart grew restless. One evening, as the sun bled its last crimson rays over the city, Cleopatra invited Antony to a private supper within the palace's lesser hall, a chamber known only to the inner circle, adorned with walls of carved cedar and mosaics depicting the triumphs of Egyptian kings long turned to dust. The table was modest by royal standards, set for two, flanked by twin braziers casting a soft amber glow. Upon the table lay simple fare: dates, honeyed figs, flatbreads brushed with olive oil, and a single decanter of Alexandrian wine. Cleopatra greeted Antony with a quiet smile, her dark hair bound in thin golden threads that shimmered like captured starlight. She poured the wine herself, her movements fluid, almost ceremonial. "To truth," she said softly, lifting her cup. Antony hesitated for a heartbeat, then mirrored her gesture. Their cups touched with a faint chime, a sound both delicate and unyielding. They drank, and for a time silence sat between them, companionable yet edged with unspoken things. The palace beyond the chamber lay hushed, the murmurs of servants and distant revelries dimmed to a tranquil hush. Finally, Cleopatra set her cup aside, her slender fingers tracing its rim as if drawing invisible patterns. "I have known kings," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the flickering brazier. "Men who spoke of love while their hands carved empires. I have known scholars who offered wisdom laced with venom, and priests who wrapped their faith in chains of fear." Her gaze lifted to meet Antony's. "But you, I believed you to be different." Antony's breath caught in his throat. Her words, neither accusation nor plea, struck him with the force of something deeper, an unguarded truth laid bare in quiet confession. "And now?" he asked, voice roughened by a storm he dared not name. Cleopatra's lips curved in a faint, almost wistful smile. "Now I wonder if I was wrong to believe that any heart, yours or mine, could remain untouched by the shadow of Caesar." Antony felt the weight of her words settle upon his chest, a pressure neither anger nor desire could cast off. He reached for her hand across the table, their fingers entwining not with the fire of lovers but with the quiet, desperate grip of two souls standing upon a precipice. "I did not come to you as Caesar's envoy," he said, his voice low. "I came as a man who loved you, who still does." Cleopatra held his gaze for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the fragile shimmer of the brazier's light. "Then let us stand apart from shadows," she whispered. "Let us be what they did not expect, a love not forged in conquest or fear, but in choice." Antony felt a tremor pass through him, a flicker of hope fragile as a reed in the wind. And yet, even as he nodded, even as his heart answered her silent plea, a lingering echo stirred at the edge of his thoughts, the voice of the merchant, the warnings of the scholar, the ghost of Caesar's silent ambition. The night deepened around them, wrapping the chamber in a hush as soft as silk. They spoke no more of Caesar, nor of fate. Instead, they lingered in quiet communion, their hands linked, their hearts wary yet unwilling to part. But beyond the gilded doors, in the shadows of the palace, a different game was unfolding. Lucius Varius, a Roman officer and once a confidant of Antony, watched from a hidden alcove as the guards shifted their posts. His face, half shrouded beneath a traveller's hood, betrayed nothing of the calculations flickering behind his keen eyes. Lucius had served with Antony on the eastern campaigns, had fought beside him in Parthia and supped with him in Roman taverns thick with soldiers' boasts. But now he served another master, a silent hand of Octavian, Rome's rising power, whose ambition burned with a quiet fury that needed no grand proclamation. As Antony and Cleopatra wove their fragile tapestry of trust, Lucius moved like a silent thread through Alexandria's streets, gathering whispers, sowing doubts, and reporting each tremor of the court back to the cold heart of Rome. For in the heart of the empire Octavian waited, not with swords drawn, but with patience honed sharper than steel. He knew the slow poison of suspicion could unravel the strongest bonds. He knew that even love, under the weight of unseen eyes and whispered fears, could become its own undoing. And so beneath the soft glow of Alexandria's stars, a darker weave took shape, a web spun not by Caesar nor by fate, but by the silent hand of a man who understood the cruel art of waiting for hearts to turn against themselves. Antony and Cleopatra, bound by love yet shadowed by legacy, stood upon a quiet brink, and Rome watched and waited. The days that followed passed like a procession of hushed uncertainties. Alexandria thrived in its opulence. The markets sang with the colours of silks and spices. The air hung heavy with the scent of incense and crushed jasmine, and the docks brimmed with traders from every corner of the known world. Yet amid the wealth and splendour, an invisible thread of unease wove its way through the hearts of those who stood closest to Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Their bond, once fierce and unshakable, now seemed wrapped in a veil of cautious tenderness. They walked the marble halls together, dined in the cool shadows of gilded chambers, and shared whispered moments beneath the open sky. But beneath each glance lay the quiet question neither dared to voice aloud. How much of what they held between them remained untouched by the ghost of Caesar? One morning, as the city stirred beneath a pale sun, Antony called for his old companion, Gaius Septimus, a seasoned centurion whose loyalty had been proven on the battlefields of Gaul and beyond. Gaius arrived in the general's private study, a chamber lined with scrolls, maps and artifacts plundered from distant lands. The scent of leather and ink mingled with the faint trace of sandalwood burning in a brass lamp. Antony sat behind a cedar desk, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon a point unseen. "You sent for me, my lord?" Gaius asked, his voice low but steady. Antony nodded slowly, motioning for him to sit. A long pause hung between them before Antony finally spoke. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what have you heard in the streets, in the barracks, among the merchants?" Gaius met his commander's gaze without flinching. "Whispers, my lord, talk of Rome, of Octavian's messengers moving unseen in Alexandria, of men who speak of Caesar's legacy in dark corners of the harbour." Antony's jaw tightened. "And of Cleopatra." Gaius hesitated, choosing his words with care. "There are those who say her heart still beats for the glory of Egypt, that her bond with you serves her crown more than her heart." The words stung, though they came softly, offered without malice. Antony leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "And do you believe that, Gaius?" The centurion shook his head. "I believe only what I see, and I see a queen who fears losing all, and a man who fears losing her." Antony's mouth curved into a grim semblance of a smile. "You've grown wise in your old age." Gaius allowed himself a faint grin, though it faded quickly. "The wise learn that love and power rarely share the same bed without a dagger between them." Antony let the silence settle, his mind turning over the words. At last he stood and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens where Cleopatra often strolled in the early hours. The sun's rays glinted off the silver of the Nile, a river both life-giver and silent witness to centuries of kings and conquerors. "I cannot tell where Caesar's hand ends and her heart begins," Antony murmured, more to himself than to Gaius, "and yet I cannot walk away." Behind him, Gaius rose, his voice firm yet respectful. "Then watch her, not as a soldier watches an enemy, but as a man watches the sea. The tides will reveal what the surface hides." Antony turned, a flicker of gratitude softening the sharp lines of his face. "Thank you, old friend." Gaius inclined his head, then left as quietly as he had come. That evening, Antony found Cleopatra in the library, a vast chamber of high domed ceilings, its walls lined with scrolls bearing the wisdom of empires long fallen. She sat upon a low couch, a scroll unfurled upon her lap, her slender fingers tracing the faded ink of ancient lines. The soft glow of oil lamps bathed her in a golden hue, lending her an ethereal grace. Antony watched her for a moment before stepping forward. "What do you read?" he asked gently. Cleopatra looked up, her expression softening at the sight of him. "A tale of the old pharaohs, of a king who loved a woman beyond reason, and in doing so lost both his heart and his kingdom." Antony's brow lifted slightly. "And does the story end in tragedy?" Cleopatra's lips curved in a faint smile. "All stories of love and power end in tragedy, or in legend." He crossed the room slowly, sitting beside her upon the couch. For a moment neither spoke, their gazes resting upon the inked words between them. "Cleopatra," Antony said at last, his voice low, "tell me truly, when you look at me, do you see a man or a shadow of Caesar?" She turned to him, her dark eyes deep as the Nile at midnight. "I see a man who fears he is a shadow, and that fear blinds him to the light he holds." Antony searched her face, seeking the cracks where deception might hide. But all he saw was the quiet sorrow of a woman who carried the weight of a kingdom and the burden of a heart entwined with a man she could neither fully trust nor let go. He reached for her hand, clasping it gently. Her fingers trembled beneath his touch, not with fear, but with the unspoken fragility of hearts stretched thin upon the loom of fate. "I do not know," Antony whispered, "if we are standing at the edge of a legend or a tragedy." Cleopatra's lips brushed his knuckles in a feather-like kiss. "Perhaps we are standing upon both." And in the soft hush of the library, with the shadows of ancient wisdom surrounding them, the dark truth loomed ever closer. A truth neither could outrun, woven in whispers and destined to unravel in the quiet war between love, power, and the lingering shadow of Caesar's eternal will. The dawn broke pale and cool over Alexandria, casting a silvery glow upon the quiet city still wrapped in sleep. Yet within the palace, sleep came fitfully to those whose lives danced upon the delicate thread of empire and desire. In the soft hush before the city stirred, Cleopatra sat upon a cushioned bench in her private garden, a secluded haven where roses climbed over marble trellises and the air hung heavy with the sweet scent of blooming myrrh. She wore no crown, no gilded ornament, only a simple robe of pale linen, her dark hair unadorned and falling in soft waves over her shoulders. Her hands lay folded in her lap, still, as though sculpted from ivory. Before her, upon a low table, lay a sealed scroll, its wax imprint bearing the crest of the Roman Senate. It had arrived with a quiet discretion that marked matters of grave consequence. A messenger from Octavian himself, cloaked as a trader's courier, had slipped into the palace grounds under the veil of darkness, delivering the missive into the hands of Cleopatra's most trusted chamberlain. The queen's heart, long hardened to the intrigues of men, had nonetheless trembled at the sight of the seal. She sat in silence, staring at the scroll as though it might dissolve under her gaze. Behind her, soft footsteps stirred upon the stone. Cleopatra did not turn, for she knew the tread well, the sound of Mark Antony's approach, familiar as her own heartbeat. "You hold a message," Antony said quietly, coming to stand at her side. Cleopatra nodded, her fingers brushing lightly over the seal. "From Rome." Antony's jaw tightened. He reached out, resting his hand upon the back of the bench beside her. "Do you know its contents?" he asked. Cleopatra's eyes lifted to meet his, calm and dark as a moonlit sea. "I know it bears Octavian's hand, and I know that nothing he sends comes without a blade hidden within the parchment." Antony's hand curled slightly, fingers pressing into the marble. "Then why do you not open it?" She offered a faint, almost wistful smile. "Because once opened, it cannot be unopened, and perhaps, for a little while longer, I wish to sit in a world where its words did not yet exist." Antony stared at her, his heart twisting with a quiet ache. He sank down beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "I will face it with you," he said softly. Cleopatra looked upon him, searching his eyes. "Will you face me, if its words are meant to divide us?" Antony's throat tightened. "Yes." Without breaking her gaze, Cleopatra lifted the scroll. With a swift, silent motion, she broke the seal and unfurled the parchment. The soft crackle of ancient fibers seemed to echo in the stillness of the garden. Her eyes scanned the neat but precise script, Latin words penned with the cold efficiency of a man who understood the art of veiled threats. Antony watched her face, searching for signs in the soft movements of her lips, the faint crease of her brow. At last, Cleopatra lowered the scroll into her lap. "Well?" Antony asked, his voice low. Cleopatra exhaled slowly. "Octavian extends an offer." Antony's brows lifted. "An offer." Her lips curved in a bitter smile. "An ultimatum, thinly veiled as diplomacy. He invites me to leave Alexandria, to come to Rome, as an honored guest of the Senate." Antony's heart pounded. An honored guest, or a gilded prisoner? Cleopatra's eyes darkened. "He does not say, but he promises protection, generous tributes, and the restoration of Egypt's former trade privileges." Antony leaned forward, his hands braced upon his knees. "And of me? What does he say of me?" Cleopatra's gaze softened, a shadow of sorrow passing over her face. "Nothing. Your name is not written." A cold silence fell between them, heavier than stone. Antony laughed once, soft, bitter. "He wishes to sever us, to draw you into Rome's embrace and leave me a relic of a war already lost." Cleopatra reached out, her hand resting gently upon his. "It is not written what I must do." Antony turned to her, meeting her steady gaze. "But what will you do?" She answered not with words, but with the quiet tightening of her fingers around his, an answer both fragile and defiant. The hours passed as a slow procession. The court awoke with its usual rhythms, advisers gathering in shaded halls, envoys arriving with gilded retinues, priests murmuring prayers in the temple of Isis. Yet beneath the gilded surface, a silent tension wove its way through the palace walls, a ripple that no tapestry of gold or song of harp could disguise. Cleopatra summoned her council to the inner chamber, a select gathering of her most loyal advisers, Roman allies and Egyptian nobles bound by oaths of fealty. They stood encircling her throne, their faces a careful mask of reverence and curiosity. She spoke softly, her words measured, yet sharp as a dagger's edge. "Octavian of Rome sends his regards," she began, her voice calm. "He invites me to his court to stand beneath the shadow of the Senate's favor." A murmur stirred among the gathered, eyes flickering with uncertainty. Cleopatra raised a hand, silencing them. "I will not go." The chamber hushed into a breathless stillness. "I will not abandon Alexandria, nor will I bend my crown beneath the weight of a Roman's yoke," she said, her voice low, firm. "And I will not stand apart from the man who has shared both my throne and my heart." Her words hung in the air like a solemn vow. Mark Antony, standing at her side, felt a slow burn of something fierce stir within his chest, not triumph nor desire, but a fragile, burning hope. Yet even as the council bowed their heads in solemn approval, a shadow flickered at the edge of the gathering. Lucius Varius, silent as a serpent in the shadows, his keen eyes narrowing. As Cleopatra's words echoed through the halls, Varius turned and slipped quietly from the chamber. His message, already inked and sealed, would soon be on its way to Rome. For Octavian had no need to command Alexandria's fall with armies. He needed only to wait. Wait for the dark truth of love and power to fray the bond that held queen and conqueror together. And in that quiet waiting, destiny would draw its silent dagger. The days that followed unfolded beneath a veil of deceptive calm. Alexandria gleamed beneath the relentless sun, its streets alive with the vibrant pulse of trade and the low hum of distant chants from temple courts. Yet beneath the surface of the bustling city, unseen currents stirred, a quiet undertow of tension that rippled through marble halls and shadowed corridors alike. In the heart of the palace, Cleopatra and Mark Antony moved together as they always had, ruling, conferring, dining side by side beneath the flicker of oil lamps. To the eyes of the court, they remained a united front, sovereign and consort, queen and general. But those who dared watch more closely, who listened with sharpened ears in the hushed antechambers, began to sense the fragile threads fraying at the edges. Mark Antony grew restless. He took to riding alone along the shoreline at dawn, his great war horse's hooves throwing up sprays of sea foam against the rocks. He returned with the wind in his hair, the taste of salt upon his lips, and a silence that grew heavier with each passing day. The soldiers whispered of his darkened mood, of the way his eyes seemed always fixed upon a horizon none could see. Cleopatra, in turn, withdrew further into her inner sanctum. She spent long hours beneath the painted ceilings of her private study, poring over ancient scrolls, consulting with astrologers, seeking perhaps in the stars what the earth denied her. Though her beauty remained undimmed, those who served her noticed the faint shadow beneath her eyes, the way her laughter softened into a wistful echo that seemed to linger too long. One evening, as Alexandria's harbour shimmered beneath the dying sun, a private meeting took place in a chamber rarely used, an old armoury deep within the palace's oldest wing, its stone walls cool and silent, lined with shields tarnished by time. Lucius Varius stood in its centre, arms folded, his Roman tunic dark against the pale stone. Across from him stood a man known only to a select few, a merchant of Phoenician blood, with the bearing of a man accustomed to carrying more than mere goods across the seas. His name was Orontes, a name whispered in the courts of both Rome and the East as a dealer of secrets, a purveyor of information whose allegiance shifted like the desert winds. Varius spoke first, his voice low and precise. "The Queen has refused Octavian's offer." Orontes inclined his head, his expression unreadable. As expected, she would not leave the power she holds, nor the man she binds herself to. Varius allowed a thin smile. And yet they drift apart. The seeds are sown. Antony's doubts grow deeper by the day. Orontes tapped a slender finger against his chin. You wish them divided, but not destroyed. Not yet. Varius's eyes glinted. Not yet. We need Antony to tear the bond himself, to stand apart by his own hand. When the world sees their love undone by his doubt, when Cleopatra stands alone, then, and only then, will Octavian strike. Orontes nodded slowly. And what role must I play? Varius stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Feed the flames, whisper in the ears of Antony's soldiers. Let them speak of Rome's disfavour, of the Queen's secret dealings. Make Antony believe that Cleopatra has already begun to turn away. Orontes' lips curved faintly. A dangerous game. Varius's gaze hardened. The most effective games always are. Without another word, the Phoenician slipped from the chamber, his footsteps silent as a shadow. Meanwhile, unaware of the silent conspiracy twisting through her court, Cleopatra sought solace in her garden, where the perfume of night-blooming jasmine softened the weight upon her heart. She walked alone, her bare feet brushing against the dew-wet grass, her hands trailing over the velvet petals of white lotus flowers floating in shallow pools. Her thoughts wandered, as they often did in those moments, to the face of the man whose heart she could neither wholly trust nor bear to lose. Mark Antony. A man torn between his Roman pride and the silent fear that perhaps, despite all they had shared, he remained little more than a chapter in her story, a protector, a lover, a figure destined to be eclipsed by the memory of Caesar. Cleopatra closed her eyes, drawing in a slow breath, the cool air mingling with the faintest hint of salt upon her lips. She longed, in that quiet moment, for a world where love could stand apart from power, where a queen might love a man not for the strength of his sword or the reach of his empire, but for the shape of his heart when laid bare beneath the stars. But such a world, she knew, existed only in whispered tales and forgotten dreams. Elsewhere, across the length of the palace, Mark Antony stood upon a balcony overlooking the moonlit harbour. His arms braced against the stone, his heart pounding with a storm he could neither name nor still. Gaius Septimus joined him in the hush of the night, standing a respectful distance. "She loves you," Gaius said softly, breaking the silence. Antony let out a bitter breath. "Does she?" Gaius nodded once. "She does, but love alone is a fragile shield against the blades of Rome." Antony turned his gaze toward the darkened sea, its surface glinting beneath the pale kiss of the moon. "And am I a fool to stand by her side?" Gaius's voice held no judgment, only quiet certainty. Only a fool fears loving a woman who dares stand against an empire, but even a fool must see when the storm is coming. A faint smile touched Antony's lips, but it did not reach his eyes. The storm was coming. Of that there was no doubt. But whether it would break upon the walls of Alexandria or within the fragile hearts of a queen and her Roman consort remained a question that neither love nor loyalty could yet answer. And as the silent hours crept onward, both Cleopatra and Mark Antony felt the same quiet shadow settle upon them, a shadow woven not by swords or armies, but by the whispering hands of doubt, betrayal, and the slow, inevitable unravelling of trust. The summer wind carried with it a faint scent of brine and myrrh, as Alexandria slumbered under a veil of soft starlight. Yet within the palace walls sleep remained a stranger to both queen and general. The silent war between heart and doubt wound ever tighter around them, an invisible cord drawing their souls to the brink of an unseen chasm. Cleopatra stood upon a terrace of polished marble, her arms folded lightly around her waist, eyes fixed upon the faint lights flickering across the harbour. The soft murmur of waves filled the air like a lullaby to the restless. Behind her, the soft glow of the palace chambers cast long shadows, gilding the stone columns with a trembling light. She heard his approach long before his shadow fell beside hers. Mark Antony moved with the quiet tread of a man caught between intention and hesitation. He stopped beside her, his gaze fixed upon the dark stretch of sea. "I did not know you would be here," he said softly. Cleopatra offered a faint smile. "This place seems to draw those who cannot sleep." They stood in silence, the cool night air settling between them like a fragile veil. For a time neither spoke, content perhaps, or resigned to share in the hush that bound them. At length Antony broke the quiet, his voice low. "Word reaches me, from Rome." Cleopatra's fingers tightened slightly upon the silken sash at her waist. She kept her eyes upon the water. "And what word is that?" Antony exhaled slowly, that Octavian prepares for war. His fleets gather upon the western seas. His messengers speak openly now, of my name, of yours, of betrayal. A soft laugh escaped Cleopatra's lips, not mocking but weary. He has been gathering shadows for months. It seems now the shadows have taken shape. Antony turned toward her, his eyes dark beneath the pale gleam of starlight. They whisper that you have sent envoys to Rome, that you seek terms with Octavian in secret. Cleopatra met his gaze, her expression serene, though her heart quivered with a silent ache. And do you believe them? The air seemed to tighten between them. Antony held her eyes, searching for something, some crack in her calm, some flicker of guilt. I want to say no, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to believe in you, but every whisper, every glance from those who once stood with us, feeds the fear I cannot drown. Cleopatra lifted her hand, gently brushing her fingers against his cheek. The touch was light, like the breath of a summer wind. Fear, she murmured, is the cruelest of chains. It binds a man tighter than any fetter of iron. Antony closed his eyes briefly at her touch, feeling the weight of her words press against the raw wound of his heart. You have never lied to me, he whispered. I have never needed to, she replied. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Antony took her hand within his, pressing it softly to his lips. Then tell me, Cleopatra, he said, his voice low but steady. Do you stand with me? Not as queen beside a Roman general, but as the woman I have loved, against all the world. Her fingers trembled in his grasp, though her eyes remained steady. I stand, she whispered, with you. Not for Egypt, not for Rome, but for the man who dares to ask me this question in the dark of night, with nothing but his heart laid bare. Antony drew a slow, shaky breath. He searched her face, seeking the shadows of doubt, but all he saw was the quiet courage of a woman who had borne the weight of crowns and carried the burden of a heart untouched by conquest. Their hands remained entwined as the wind stirred softly around them, lifting the fine strands of Cleopatra's hair like a silent benediction. But beyond the fragile peace of that moment, the world moved relentlessly toward war. By morning, word had spread through the palace. Octavian's envoys had arrived upon the shores of Crete, carrying with them an open declaration of hostilities. Rome, it seemed, no longer cared for the quiet games of shadows and whispers. The storm, long brewing upon the horizon, had begun its inevitable descent. In the war chamber, Mark Antony stood before a map stretched across an ivory table, the markers of fleets and legions set upon its surface like the pieces of a deadly game. Around him gathered his most trusted captains, veterans of Roman wars and Egyptian commanders alike. Cleopatra stood at his side, her posture regal, her eyes sharp with the gleam of a strategist born of ancient royalty. We cannot fight Octavian upon Roman soil, Antony stated, his voice firm. But here, in the east, upon the seas, we hold the advantage. We will gather the fleet at Actium. We will strike before he crosses into our waters. Cleopatra's gaze flickered toward the map, her mind already turning over the currents, the winds, the unseen perils of the Ionian Sea. We must control the coastlines, she said quietly. If we trap his fleets before they land, we have a chance. Antony met her gaze with a grim nod. It was a plan born of desperation, but also of a fierce, fragile hope. In that chamber, surrounded by warriors and loyalists, they stood together, sovereign and general, queen and consort, bound by a love tested beyond the edge of doubt. But even as they charted the course of war, the darker tides of fate moved unseen. In a shadowed corner of the palace, Lucius Varius penned his latest report, his hands swift, his words precise. They stand together now, but cracks run deep beneath the surface. The fleet will sail. Yet their hearts sail upon a different course. Soon, they will drift beyond each other's reach. And in Rome, far from the golden halls of Alexandria, Octavian read the report with a slow, knowing smile. He need not strike with sword or fleet, for even the fiercest love, when stretched upon the rack of fear and doubt, would break with the softest of whispers, and the fall of Alexandria would begin within the hearts of those who had vowed never to fall. The harbour of Alexandria shimmered beneath the pale sun, its waters alive with the restless murmur of ships preparing for war. Tall Roman galleys, their oaken hulls painted with crimson and gold, floated alongside slender Egyptian triremes, adorned with prows carved in the shapes of sacred ibis and falcons. The air hung thick with the scent of pitch, seaweed, and the sweat of sailors hauling ropes and stacking provisions beneath the command of sharp-tongued officers. From the highest terrace of the palace, Cleopatra and Mark Antony watched the silent orchestration of a fleet being born of urgency and defiance. Together they stood, yet apart in thought, two sovereigns bound by love and war, and by the faint, chilling knowledge that they sailed toward a battle not just against Rome, but against something more elusive and far more dangerous, against themselves. Antony's arms were folded tightly across his chest, his gaze fixed upon the horizon where sky and sea merged in a line too distant for mortal eyes. The wind stirred the edge of his tunic, the folds of his crimson cloak trailing like a banner caught in a hesitant breeze. Cleopatra, standing at his side, allowed her gaze to drift across the fleet, her heart a quiet storm of fear, hope, and a brittle resolve she dared not let shatter. The war would come, that much was certain. But it was not the enemy without that pressed upon her heart with a shadowed hand. It was the quiet, creeping fear of the enemy within. Antony broke the silence, his voice low. "Do you trust me upon the sea, Cleopatra?" She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I trust the man who once fought an empire for a cause he believed in. But I do not trust the sea, and I do not trust the men who whisper in your ears when I am not at your side." His gaze flicked toward her, shadowed with something between hurt and understanding. "And you? Should I trust that your heart remains with me when your counsel speaks of Egypt's survival before all things?" Cleopatra's lips parted slightly, a retort upon the edge of her tongue, but she stilled it with a slow breath. "We both stand upon shifting sands, Mark Antony," she said softly. "The question is not whether we trust, but whether we dare to fall if the other lets go." Antony's shoulders tensed. He turned fully to her then, his eyes dark beneath the gleam of the sun. "I will not let go," he said, the words clipped but earnest. Cleopatra met his gaze, her hand rising slowly, resting against his chest where his heart beat beneath bronze and linen. "Nor will I," she whispered. Yet even as their words bound them together once more, neither spoke of the silent fears gnawing at the edges of their hearts. Fears stoked by rumours, by glances exchanged in passing, by the soft, insidious voices that slipped through the cracks of their once unbreakable bond. That night, a great banquet was held within the palace, a gathering of generals, captains, and noble allies called to pledge themselves before the final march of war. The grand hall glittered beneath the glow of 1,000 oil lamps, their light reflected in the polished marble and gilded columns. Rich silks hung from the rafters, perfumed with rose and frankincense, and the air thrummed with the murmur of voices and the soft strains of lyres played by veiled musicians. Cleopatra sat upon a throne of ivory and lapis lazuli, her crown a circlet of hammered gold entwined with emerald serpents. Beside her Antony stood, armoured in the manner of Roman generals, a crimson cloak flowing from his shoulders, his sword at his side, a man caught between the blood of Rome and the heart of Egypt. The feast began with toasts of loyalty, oaths sworn upon ancient gods and the names of fallen kings. Yet beneath the surface of revelry, the banquet pulsed with a strange, simmering tension, an undercurrent that Cleopatra felt as keenly as the press of her own heartbeat. Eyes watched from shadowed alcoves, voices murmured behind goblets of dark wine, and among the crowd moved Lucius Varius, his presence unobtrusive, his ears keenly attuned to every word, every glance exchanged between Roman officer and Egyptian courtier. At the height of the evening, Varius approached a gathering of Antony's closest commanders, men who had fought beside him in battles stretching from the deserts of Parthia to the forests of Gaul. With practiced ease, Varius leaned into their circle, his tone casual, his words laced with just enough doubt to set embers smouldering. "Strange, is it not," he murmured, "that a queen speaks so often of loyalty, and yet entertains envoys from lands loyal to Octavian?" The commanders exchanged wary glances. "One wonders," Varius continued, swirling the dark wine in his goblet, "whether a man's heart can withstand the weight of a queen's crown, and whether his sword might one day serve a throne not his own." The words slipped into the air like a slow-working poison, subtle, almost unnoticed, yet deadly all the same. By the time the banquet ended, the seeds of doubt had taken quiet root in the hearts of men sworn to Antony's cause. Cleopatra, watching from her high seat, felt the shift, though she could not name its source. A faint, chilling sense of a web tightening around them both. As the last of the guests withdrew into the cooling night, Antony remained at the centre of the hall, his eyes tracing the retreating backs of those who had sworn their loyalty with loud voices and forced smiles. Cleopatra approached him, her footsteps soft upon the marble. "You heard them," she said quietly. Antony nodded once. "I heard enough." She searched his face, seeking the man she had known, the man who had once defied a senate, a people, and a world for her. "Then trust in me," she whispered, "or we are lost before the first sword is drawn." Antony's eyes met hers, dark with something deeper than anger, something raw, wounded, and dangerously near despair. "I want to," he said softly. "Gods help me. I want to." And with those words a new silence fell between them, a silence heavier than accusation, colder than betrayal. For both knew that trust once cracked is not mended by words nor by vows, but by something far more fragile. By the choice to hold on, even when the heart begins to let go. And in that silent, aching space between them, the quiet unravelling of an empire had already begun. The morning sun rose upon Alexandria with a deceptive softness, casting golden hues over the city's domes and the calm waters of its bustling harbour. Yet within the palace walls that golden light seemed brittle. A thin veneer stretched over hearts weighed down by suspicion, pride, and the slow, silent war of unspoken doubts. Cleopatra sat alone in her private chamber, a scroll spread before her upon a low ivory table. The soft rustle of papyrus echoed faintly in the hush of the room, where only the distant coo of doves broke the fragile quiet. Her fingers traced the inked lines, letters from emissaries in sight, reports from Phoenician traders, warnings from spies stationed in the Roman provinces. All spoke of one thing. Octavian's fleet moved steadily across the Aegean. With each passing day, his power drew closer, like a storm gathering upon the distant horizon, silent, relentless, inevitable. And in its shadow, Cleopatra felt the tightening grip of a fate that not even her cunning nor her beauty could escape. Yet it was not the storm of Octavian that chilled her blood. It was the colder, subtler storm she saw gathering behind Antony's eyes. He had grown quieter with each dawn, his words fewer, his silences longer. Where once he had sought her counsel, now he met her thoughts with brief nods, half smiles that never touched his eyes. He rode more often with his Roman commanders, dined with them in private councils, and listened, oh how he listened, to the quiet murmurs that slipped like venom into the ears of men weary of a war that had yet to be fought. Cleopatra closed her eyes, pressing her slender fingers against her temples. It was happening, the unravelling. Not in shouts nor accusations, but in the slow drift of hearts once bound by love and fire, now loosened by fear and the thousand whispers of doubt. A soft knock stirred the stillness. "Enter," Cleopatra said, her voice composed, though her heart thudded with a quiet ache. A slender figure stepped through the carved doorway, Charmian, her most trusted handmaiden and confidant since girlhood. Though still youthful, Charmian's eyes held the wisdom of one who had seen the turning of courts, the rise and fall of lovers, the slow betrayal of even the closest hearts. "My queen," Charmian said softly, bowing her head, "Lord Antony asks if you will join him upon the western terrace." Cleopatra opened her eyes slowly, gazing at the flickering lamp beside her. For a moment she said nothing. Then she rose, her movements graceful and deliberate. "I will come," she whispered. The western terrace overlooked the sprawling harbour, its white marble floor veined with blue lapis that caught the morning light like veins of fire. Antony stood near the balustrade, his hands resting upon its smooth surface, eyes fixed upon the fleet stretching across the waters below. He did not turn when Cleopatra approached. For a moment she stood beside him in silence, letting the wind lift strands of her dark hair, tasting the salt and sunlight upon her lips. Then she spoke. "You asked for me." Antony nodded slightly, his gaze never leaving the horizon. "I did." Another pause. At last he spoke again, his voice low, edged with something both brittle and raw. "I have heard things." Cleopatra's heart gave a slow, painful thud. "What things?" He turned his head slightly, his eyes shadowed beneath the weight of sleepless nights. "That you have sent word to Octavian, that you seek terms." Cleopatra stared at him, her pulse quickening. "And do you believe that?" His jaw clenched. I do not know what to believe anymore." The words fell between them like a blade, sharp and final. She drew a slow breath, mastering the storm within her. "I have sent no word," she said quietly. "Not to Octavian, not to any man who would stand against you." Antony looked at her fully then, his eyes searching, pleading for something. Truth, perhaps, or the strength to believe. "But you have thought of it," he said softly. The truth hovered upon the edge of her lips, trembling like a shadow caught between light and dark. "I have thought," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "of what becomes of Egypt if I lose you." Antony closed his eyes briefly, the weight of her words settling like a stone upon his heart. "And I," he murmured, "have thought of what becomes of me if I lose you." For a long moment neither spoke. Then Cleopatra reached for his hand, her fingers entwining with his, not with the passion of lovers nor the cold grasp of allies, but with the silent desperation of two souls clinging to a bond fraying at its edges. "Do not let them divide us," she whispered. "Not them, not Octavian, not the whispers of men who fear what we are together." Antony's hand tightened around hers, the storm in his heart raging against the walls of his pride. "I will try," he said softly, "but God's help me. I do not know if I am strong enough." She met his gaze, her heart twisting at the quiet ache she saw there. The ache of a man torn between love and legacy, between the woman before him and the empire that waited with sharpened knives at his back. "Then let us be strong enough, together," she whispered. A faint, bitter smile touched Antony's lips. "For as long as the gods permit," he murmured. They stood together upon the terrace as the wind stirred the sails of the fleet below, two hearts bound in a fragile truce, clinging to love in a world unravelling beneath the silent march of fate. And somewhere, beyond the reach of their whispered vows, the dark tide of destiny gathered with patient hands, waiting for the moment when even love's strongest bonds would snap beneath the weight of a war they could neither flee nor win. The flicker of torchlight danced across the cool marble walls as dawn's first pale glow crept through the narrow arches of Cleopatra's private chamber. In this hushed moment, deep in the heart of her palace in Alexandria, Caesarion, her young son with Julius Caesar, slept soundly upon a plush cushion. Cleopatra herself lay nearby, her restless mind stirring like the sea at midnight. Across the Mediterranean, Mark Antony's war camp in Asia stirred to life as whispered rumours reached the ears of his officers. Cleopatra has summoned news from Italy. Caesar's spies roam Alexandria. This was the threshold of what would become the 19th chapter of a love triangle's final act. A dark truth, hidden behind all political games, all whispered promises, now surfaced like deep-sea wreckage. The very survival of Cleopatra's bloodline depended on the willingness of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony to set aside everything, honour, pride, empire, for one clandestine motive that neither of them would dare admit aloud. In Rome, Julius Caesar, returning from his campaigns in Gaul, felt the weight of innumerable conspiracies pressing upon him, senators devouring one another in whispers, walls listening, allies betraying. But there was another, far more personal burden that none could suspect. The knowledge that Cleopatra's fate and her son's hung in precarious balance. Caesar had made clandestine promises, safe passage, recognition, legitimacy. Egypt's royal line would be honoured, their bloodline permitted to survive beyond the veil of Roman conquest. These assurances were delivered in whispered nights by torchlight, sealed with tokens and kisses, binding Cleopatra and herself to his destiny. Yet to speak such things openly in the Senate? To recognize Caesarion as Caesar's son with claims of godlike lineage? That would tear Rome apart. And so, Caesar guarded the secret like a reliquary. He would publicly ignore his liaison with Cleopatra, even speaking sharply against extending her power. To unveil the truth would spell civil war again, between Rome and Rome. The dark truth remained locked in his heart. He loved Cleopatra enough to see her dynasty live on, yet feared Rome enough to smother the idea. Mark Antony, now aware of Caesar's intentions, experienced a violence of emotion fierce enough to shake even the scarred heart of a general. He had once believed his bond with Cleopatra was cemented by destiny, a love that transcended empire, colour, culture. Yet now the cunning queen, playing her cards with precision, sought to preserve the son of another man. And more vicious still, Caesar himself offered promise to Cleopatra's line, while Antony's own political position slowly crumbled. Antony's dark truth, however, was his guilt. He recognized that at the height of his love he had plotted against his friend Caesar, had raised legions in Asia Minor without Caesar's blessing. His soldiers whispered of his tyranny, of how his name was praised as divine in the East. Yet Cleopatra, with supple diplomacy, had offered him more than affection. She had offered him a kingdom, the adoration of her people, a chance to rival Caesar himself. Antony had accepted, but he had also feared that he would never truly be enough for her, overshadowed by Caesar's shadow. In this torment lay the dark truth. Antony's love was laced with fear and inadequacy. He believed Cleopatra might abandon him if a chance arose to save Caesarion, and with him, her hope for a lasting dynasty under the shadow of Rome. Antony feared not losing her love now, but losing the promise of legacy, losing the power to invoke Cleopatra's undying loyalty. In Alexandria's sunlit court, Cleopatra sensed the rising tension. She had always been called shrewd, resourceful, even merciless, but her heart ached more poignantly than any criticism could wound. She carried the weight of 2 sons in her womb, one by Caesar, one by Antony, and each rested within her heart as a precious secret. To Caesarion she owed his life and his inheritance. To the unnamed child within her, she owed her ambition and the symbolic unity of the East and West. Yet deliberately, Cleopatra chose to keep them separate. Caesarion would be raised in the grandeur of Alexandria, a prince whose blood would carry both Persian Hellenistic lineage and Roman patrician grace. Antony's son, if born, would represent Alexandria's union with the Roman East. But she dared not make these truths public yet, until both men could be safely convinced. She balanced their affections like an acrobat upon a rope, entertaining Antony's presumption that he would be the father of her heir, while still whispering sweet submissiveness to Caesar when news of him reached her through couriers. This art of deception weighed heavily on her. Each night, in the privacy of her bedchamber, she unraveled the webs she had spun. The weight of these secret lineage promises twisted her soul. To manipulate 2 of Rome's greatest men for the sake of preserving her dynasty. It was power, yes, but it was also her curse. On one starlit evening, as Antony dined beneath the pergola of jasmine vines, Cleopatra appeared alone, raven-haired, luminous in the lamplight, bearing a scroll sealed with Caesar's ring. The stirrings of candles flickered across her dark eyes as she presented it. "Mark Antony," she cooed, "a decree from Caesar himself, granting recognition to Caesarion as his true-born child and heir of Rome. He wishes it made public." Shock knifed through Antony faster than any sword. Cleopatra read the shock in his face and softened her tone. "Fear not," she whispered, voice slow and mesmerizing. "We can delay announcement, but this is the price Caesar exacts if he is to preserve the boy's right to survive." Antony's face throbbed crimson. In that instant, he understood. Cleopatra had used her former lover to manipulate this outcome. Caesar had recognized his son, or threatened to expose his lineage, creating a bond strong enough to dissuade Antony's interference. Cleopatra, in her infinite cunning, had set the wheels in motion so that neither man could betray her openly without losing face, without shattering the careful fabric of power. But the hidden dark truth did not simply lie in her duplicity. It lay deeper still. Cleopatra had struck a bargain with Rome. In exchange for her dynasty's recognition, she would offer concessions Antony didn't yet know. Naval support, grain shipments, political alliances. She had bound Caesar and Antony like 2 pillars holding her aloft, but to break that structure would cause everything to collapse. Weeks later, Antony confided in his closest lieutenant, Decimus Malleus. They spoke under moonlight beyond the gaze of Cleopatra's eunuchs. "She holds our hearts in her hands," Antony whispered, voice heavy with frustration. "But this twisting of trust with Caesar, I must act before she tips the balance too far." Decimus watched his general's torment, hesitant. "Shall I raise the legions, sir?" Antony shook his head. "No open war. We need evidence. Proof that Caesar plotted to recognize Caesarion publicly. Then we can demand parity, or, if necessary, we can force her hand." But even Decimus's words ran into the barrier of Antony's conflicted loyalties. To challenge Cleopatra would risk tearing the woman he loved, fracturing Alexandria's fragile peace. To oppose Caesar too harshly would risk war with Rome. The dark truth of Antony's predicament lodged like a spear in his heart. He had to decide between love, legacy, and empire. Meanwhile, Caesar in Rome found himself haunted by the knowledge that Antony believed him powerless, bound by Cleopatra's words, yet pretending to agree allowed him to control the situation. He issued edicts strengthening Cleopatra's position in Egypt, quietly shipping loyal Roman officers to Alexandria, ensuring Caesarion's protection. But each decree nudged him closer to the traditionalists in the Senate, who whispered of Caesar's growing tyranny and softness. Caesar felt trapped. He could not fully embrace his son's inheritance without fracturing Rome's unity, could not fully trust Antony to abide by their unspoken pact, and could not risk Cleopatra's power unraveling. At the dead of night, Caesar would gaze at the stars from his villa, charting the constellations that rose above the sea. Here in the darkness, he allowed himself one protected confession, that he loved two things above all: Cleopatra, whose brilliance cast such radiance across the world, and Caesarion, whose blood carried his name into posterity. And he questioned if he could ever sacrifice one without destroying the other. In Alexandria, Cleopatra moved like an empress possessed. She consulted with priests in the temple of Serapis, deciphering omens. The oracles bark, the rustle of parchment, the symbols read as warnings of a broken alliance, foretold that if Caesar's heir were not recognized by both Rome and Egypt, then blood would flow, and power would splinter like cracked marble. She watched Julius Caesar on the Nile barges and heard rumors of Antony's restlessness along the coast. She sensed that she teetered on the cusp of something dangerous, something greater than even her wildest dreams, a crisis that might shatter worlds. And here, under moonlight, she prepared another move. She commissioned a statue of Caesarion as infant pharaoh, features combining Roman and Greek visage. She had artists etch it with hieroglyphs, son of Isis and Ra, child of Rome's greatest. She would display it before Alexander's tomb, invoking the legacy of empire. The declaration would be undeniable. Antony and Caesar would see it and recognize the truth of her purpose. Thus, the dark truth trembled on the horizon. Cleopatra's heart was both her greatest weapon and her cruelest prison. She loved both men, each in different ways. She would not, could not, let either stand in the way of the future she envisioned. A united dynasty that bridged East and West, Rome and Egypt through her blood. But to pursue this vision, she must weave each of them into her tapestry, conceal the seams, and hope neither tore it apart. And so, as dusk descended over Alexandria in the 19th evening of intrigue, the stage was set for the largest gamble of all. Torchlight, whispers, statues, secret promises, all played against an empire balanced upon a spindle. The dark truths pulsed beneath the surface, shaping destinies, forging alliances, threatening to break them. What would come next? Would Antony realize the extent of Cleopatra's manipulation before Caesar's recognition became irreversible? Would Caesar defy Rome and embrace his son boldly, or abandon him to keep peace? And what price would Cleopatra pay for binding love and politics so tightly together? These questions hung heavy in the night air. All that remained was the turning of the wheel. And for our lovers and rulers, the dawn of their destinies lay just beyond the horizon. End of part 19. 1,066 words. Beneath a sky brushed with the soft hues of Alexandrian dawn, Cleopatra stood at the highest terrace of her palace, her silhouette still against the slow-moving waters of the harbour below. The statue of Caesarion, freshly unveiled at the Temple of Alexander, had stirred the city's heart, and with it had stirred the delicate tensions that stretched across empires. The streets murmured with awe, priests sang hymns in hushed tones, and sailors from distant lands whispered of the Queen's daring declaration. Yet in the marble corridors of power, unease brewed like a storm on the horizon. Cleopatra's gambit had been bold beyond imagination. By commissioning a public statue proclaiming Caesarion as heir of both Egypt and Rome, she had set into motion a chain of consequences that none could reverse. The populace of Alexandria, always fond of their queen's grandeur, embraced the symbol with rapture. They saw in Caesarion a new Alexander, a boy king destined to unite the known world. But in the quiet chambers where power truly stirred, her move rippled like a tremor beneath fragile alliances. Mark Antony received news of the statue as he dined on the coast, his camp flanked by the watchful hills of Cyrenaica. The messenger, a slim youth of Roman blood, presented the report on a scroll tied with purple ribbon. As Antony unsealed it, the edges of his lips tightened. "She dares," Antony muttered, reading of the statue's inscription. "The son of Caesar, the son of Isis, crowned before Rome declares him so." Decimus Malleus, ever at Antony's side, stood in silent dread. He dared not speak, but the truth hung between them. Cleopatra had stepped beyond the whispered alliances. She had dragged Caesar's hidden promises into the daylight, binding Antony's hands by a chain of public expectation. Antony crushed the scroll in his fist. His mind raced with calculations, weighing loyalty against power, love against political survival. The dark truth clawed at him with relentless clarity. Cleopatra was no pawn in this game. She was the master player, moving both him and Caesar like pieces on a board gilded with gold and stained with old blood. In Rome, Julius Caesar sat before the Senate, his expression carved in impassivity as a courier from Alexandria bowed low, presenting a carved wooden model of the statue. The senators watched with silent horror as Caesar studied the miniature figure, a young boy garbed in pharaonic splendor, crowned with a diadem entwined with Roman laurels. The murmurs swelled like a tide. An heir, named by a foreign queen. Cleopatra crowns her bastard as a Roman prince. Does Caesar mean to make himself king of Egypt? The Senate's fear gnawed at Caesar's carefully constructed image of control. He spoke little, dismissing the courier with a slight wave of his hand, his mind churning with silent fury. Cleopatra had pressed his hand. What once was a whispered promise shared in the quiet of an Alexandrian night had become a public decree, one that now threatened the unity of Rome itself. But the darkest truth that twisted in Caesar's heart was not the Senate's suspicion, nor the precariousness of his authority. It was the whisper of longing that echoed in his soul. He wanted Caesarion to be recognized. He dreamed of a son who would inherit his strength, who would reign over a world unified under Rome and Egypt. Yet even in his heart, he knew this dream bore the taste of poison. To reach for it openly would be to invite assassination, rebellion, the collapse of everything he had bled to build. Caesar's eyes, cold and calculating, lifted toward the marble columns of the Curia. In that fleeting moment, a darker resolve kindled within him. If Cleopatra had forced his hand, then he would force hers as well. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra moved through her court with the grace of a queen, yet the vigilance of a hunted falcon. News of Antony's reaction had reached her ears through whispered channels, soft as the flutter of silk in the wind. She sensed his rage, his wounded pride, the slow coiling of his suspicion. And yet she felt no regret. Her heart, though entangled in love's web, beat with the steely rhythm of a ruler born to survive. She had known Antony's pride would smart. She had known Caesar would reel from her boldness. But she had also known that to do nothing, to let their whispered promises fade like mist, would doom her and her son to a future of shadows, waiting for the axe of Roman politics to fall upon their necks. Cleopatra met with her most trusted advisers, the old priest Animhor and the scribe Horemheb, beneath the painted dome of her private chamber. The air smelled of frankincense and lotus blossoms. "I have made my move," Cleopatra said softly, her voice steady, "and now the lion must choose whether to strike or to guard his cub." Animhor bowed low. "And if both lions turn upon you, my queen?" She gazed into the oil lamps that flickered upon the marble table, her eyes reflecting the flames. "Then I must show them that I am no mere prize of war to be passed between hands. They will see me as their equal, or not at all." Horemheb, ancient and wise, nodded slowly. "Then, mistress, your heart must be harder than their swords." As days turned to weeks, emissaries sailed between Rome and Alexandria under veils of secrecy. Messages hidden in bolts of silk, whispered across guarded thresholds, carried words heavy with veiled threats and careful promises. From Caesar came a message cloaked in the language of diplomacy. The recognition of a son is a matter for Rome and Rome alone. Public displays without Senate approval tread upon dangerous ground. I implore discretion for your sake and mine. Cleopatra read the message, her lips parting with a silent sigh. Caesar's words were soft, yet his meaning sharp as a dagger. He demanded her silence. But his choice of phrasing revealed something deeper. He did not reject Caesarion's claim outright. There remained a window, a slender, trembling thread of hope. From Antony came no formal reply. but rumors swept into Alexandria on merchant ships. The Roman general had doubled his military preparations, consolidating legions across the eastern provinces. His captains whispered of an impending campaign, of securing his influence before Caesar could tighten his grip. The message, though silent, rang clear in Cleopatra's heart. Antony would not be manipulated. He would act, but on his own terms. One evening, as twilight cast Alexandria in a soft amber glow, Cleopatra stood alone on her palace balcony, watching a ship slip silently into the harbour. Upon its prow flew a banner, gold upon crimson, a mark she recognised instantly. Mark Antony had come. He arrived under cover of dusk, with only a handful of trusted guards. No fanfare, no grand parade, only a private summons to the Queen's chamber. When Antony entered, his eyes dark as storm clouds, Cleopatra greeted him not as a lover, but as a sovereign. They stood alone in the quiet chamber, the hush between them thick with years of passion, betrayal, and unspoken fears. "I warned you," Antony said, voice low, dangerous, "and yet you forced my hand before Caesar, before Rome." Cleopatra's chin lifted, her voice soft yet unwavering. "I forced no one. I claimed what was mine." Antony stepped closer, his breath shallow. "You risked everything for your son, for his son." The word hung in the air like a blade. Cleopatra did not flinch. "I risked everything," she whispered, "for Egypt, for our future, for the legacy that must survive both of you." A bitter laugh escaped Antony's lips. "And what legacy is that? One where you play us both for fools, where you hold our hearts like dice in your hands, gambling on a kingdom built on deception." Cleopatra stepped forward, her hand brushing his cheek, her touch light as the Nile breeze. "I play the only game I am allowed to play, the game that ensures none of us loses everything we hold dear." For a long moment, Antony searched her eyes, and what he saw there stole the fire from his anger. A queen's fierce love for her people, a mother's desperate hope for her child, a woman's silent torment as she danced upon a razor's edge. Antony sighed, shoulders slumping. "And if we fall, Cleopatra? If Caesar turns against us both?" She drew close, her voice a mere breath. "Then we fall together, or we rise together." And in that fragile, trembling space between heartbeats, the two lovers stood, no longer queen and general, no longer deceiver and betrayed, but two souls bound by a dark truth neither could escape. For the wheel had turned and the endgame had begun. The hush of midnight fell soft upon the sleeping city of Alexandria, its harbour glistening under the embrace of a silvered moon. In the shadowed corridors of the royal palace, torches guttered low, their flames casting long, wavering silhouettes upon the polished walls. Within Cleopatra's inner sanctum, a conversation unfolded, one that would echo through the chambers of history, veiled in secrecy and guarded by hearts laced with fear, longing and grim resolve. Mark Antony stood before Cleopatra, the weight of countless battles heavy upon his broad shoulders, but none as burdensome as the war now waged within his heart. The queen, resplendent yet sombre in a robe of deepest indigo, faced him with the poise of a sovereign, though her eyes shimmered with the silent tempest of a woman who had placed all upon a single roll of destiny's dice. "I came," Antony began, his voice low and edged with weariness, "to look into your eyes and find the truth, not of Caesar nor of Rome, but of you, Cleopatra." The queen held his gaze, unflinching, the moments stretched, drawn thin by the brittle threads of trust long frayed. Antony's eyes searched her face for some flicker of deceit, some shadow of betrayal. But what he saw stirred something deeper, a reflection of his own tormented soul. "Is this a game to you?" he whispered, stepping closer. "Am I another piece upon your gilded board?" Her lips parted, a faint exhale escaping as she shook her head. "You have never been a piece, Mark Antony. You have always been a player. I made my move, but I never moved you." He studied her in the silence that followed, a silence dense with the unspoken scars they both carried. Slowly his hands unclenched, falling to his sides. "And Caesar?" he asked, voice softer now. "Does he hold your heart still?" A shadow flickered across Cleopatra's features, not of guilt nor of regret, but of something more profound. Her gaze drifted toward the balcony, where the first pale tendrils of dawn began to chase the darkness. "Caesar," she murmured, "held a part of me that belonged to a younger woman, a queen struggling to survive in a world that would see her broken. He offered me power, a legacy. But you," her voice faltered, then steadied, "you hold the part of me that dared to dream beyond survival." Antony's heart tightened, the rawness of her words cutting through the fortress of suspicion he had built around himself. In her voice he heard no manipulation, no political maneuvering, only the aching vulnerability of a woman who loved, who feared, who fought for something greater than power alone. "And yet," Antony said quietly, "you ask me to stand against Caesar, to risk everything I have, everything we have built, for a future even you cannot promise." Cleopatra's eyes met his, luminous in the soft glow of dawn. "I ask you to stand with me, because the future I dream of is not mine alone, it is ours, and Caesarians." The name fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that neither could measure. Antony turned away, pacing slowly toward the open balcony, his hands clasped behind his back. The sea stretched before him, vast and inscrutable, mirroring the turmoil within. "He is not my son," Antony said after a long pause. "And yet, if I stand with you, I would be called father to a child whose blood ties me forever to Caesar." Cleopatra joined him at the balcony's edge, her hand resting lightly upon the stone balustrade. The wind stirred her hair, dark tendrils dancing in the morning breeze. "He may not be of your blood," she whispered, "but he would be of your legacy. A bridge between worlds, a son of Egypt and Rome, guided by a man worthy of both thrones." Antony turned his head, his eyes searching hers once more. "And if I refuse?" A faint, bittersweet smile touched Cleopatra's lips. "Then I will fight alone, and I will lose alone, but I will never bow, nor betray the dream I have built." Her words, soft as they were, struck Antony with the force of a hammer. In that moment he saw not a queen manipulating lovers, nor a woman ensnaring men of power, but a sovereign willing to stand alone against the might of empires for the sake of a vision only she dared to believe in. And something within him stirred, an echo of the man he had once been. A soldier of Rome, yes, but also a dreamer who believed in causes greater than himself. A man who had fought for comrades, for love, for honor. And now, perhaps, for a queen who dared to dream beyond survival. Antony reached for her hand, his fingers closing gently around hers. "If I stand with you," he said softly, "we will stand together against Caesar, against Rome, against the world itself if we must." Cleopatra's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She squeezed his hand, a silent vow passing between them, one that bound their hearts tighter than any spoken oath. "We will stand," she whispered, "or we will fall, but we will fall as one." As the sun climbed over Alexandria's ivory rooftops, a plan was set into motion. A plan whispered in the halls of power, inked upon secret scrolls, and carried upon swift ships across the Mediterranean. Mark Antony would summon his eastern legions under the guise of a campaign against Parthia. Cleopatra would marshal Egypt's wealth, her fleets, and her influence over the eastern client kings. Together, they would forge a new power, a sovereign bloc capable of challenging even the might of Rome. It would be a bold move, one wrought with peril. But neither lover spoke of failure. The dark truth that clung to their hearts was this: victory might buy them a future, but defeat would mean ruin, disgrace, and death. Yet they moved forward, their resolve steeled by a force stronger than fear, a love too defiant to surrender. As Alexandria bustled beneath the rising sun, unaware of the storm gathering beyond the horizon, Cleopatra and Antony stood upon the precipice of fate, their hands clasped, their eyes fixed upon the uncertain dawn. In the quiet before the tempest, a single truth remained, no longer hidden, no longer denied. Together they would gamble everything, and together they would face whatever destiny had in store. The summer of Alexandria dawned with a deceptive calm, its skies brushed in pale blues and soft golds, the air heavy with the perfume of jasmine and the distant hum of the sea. In the heart of the palace, Cleopatra and Mark Antony moved like sovereign shadows, calm, composed, but with hearts beating in silent urgency. They had made their choice. Now the world itself would shift around them, whether in harmony or in violent discord. As preparations swelled within Alexandria's harbours, Antony's legions began to muster along the Nile's banks. Warships, sleek, dark, and bristling with the silent promise of battle, bobbed in the gentle waves, their prows gleaming beneath the relentless sun. Roman centurions drilled eastern auxiliaries, and Egyptian crews loaded supplies by the thousands. Cleopatra herself oversaw the assembly of her fleet, her presence upon the docks a sight that stirred both pride and quiet fear among her people. Yet beneath this orchestration of power lay a current unseen by the common eye, a silent exchange of letters, secret emissaries dispatched under the cloak of darkness. Across the sea, Julius Caesar received these messages with a heart colder than any marble column in his Roman villa. The missives carried rumours, accusations, and veiled threats. Reports spoke of Antony's alliance with Cleopatra tightening beyond mere politics, of legions being pledged not in Rome's name, but in the name of their union. Ships flew Antony's standard alongside the royal sigil of Egypt. Caesar read these lines in grim silence, the weight of their meaning pressing heavily upon him. In the solitude of his study, Caesar stared long into the flickering candlelight, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The dark truth he had long evaded now stood before him, inescapable and unyielding. Mark Antony, his friend, his brother-in-arms, had crossed a line drawn by the very gods of power, and Cleopatra, enchantress, queen and mother of his blood's heir, had dared to defy Rome's will openly. He could not ignore it, yet his heart wavered. Deep within, Caesar fought a silent war no blade could resolve. He remembered the warmth of Cleopatra's embrace, the fierce brilliance of her mind, the soft curve of her smile beneath moonlit skies. He remembered holding Caesarion as an infant, the child's small hand curling around his finger, a future emperor, perhaps, in those tiny grasping fingers. But he also remembered the Senate's venomous whispers, the daggers of envy that lurked in every Roman corridor. If he allowed Antony and Cleopatra to rise unchecked, Rome would fracture. His own power would shatter. The dream of unity, of a world ruled by law and order, would dissolve into chaos. Yet if he moved against them, he would be raising a sword against not just former allies, but against the mother of his son, and perhaps against the son himself. The dark truth? Caesar feared the answer. For in choosing Rome, he might be condemning the only fragments of love and legacy he truly possessed. In Alexandria, beneath the ornate ceilings of the Royal War Council chamber, Antony and Cleopatra mapped the future they dared to seize. They gathered around a vast wooden table, spread with maps inked in both Latin and Greek. Red markers denoted legions under Antony's command. Gold pins marked Cleopatra's fleet and the allied kings of the eastern provinces, Armenia, Cappadocia, Commagene. They spoke in hushed, measured tones, yet every word struck with the weight of destiny. "We must secure the loyalty of the eastern vassals," Antony said, tracing a line from Syria to Judea with a steady hand. "If Caesar moves, it will be swift and with overwhelming force. We must stand ready, not as separate factions, but as a single sovereign front." Cleopatra nodded, her slender fingers resting lightly upon the ivory handle of a fan. "I will summon Herod of Judea. He owes me more than favours, and the Nabateans, they value Egypt's grain above all. We will remind them of their debts." Antony's eyes softened slightly as he regarded her. In moments like this, she was not merely a queen nor a lover, but a partner in every sense of the word. A woman whose intellect matched his own, whose resolve might well surpass it. "And Caesarion?" Antony asked quietly after a pause. "What of him?" Cleopatra's gaze lingered upon the map, her eyes distant. "He will remain here, safe, guarded by those loyal beyond question. If we fall, he must live." The unspoken words clung in the air. If we fall. A fate neither dared to voice, yet both understood lay in the shadow of every choice they now made. As midsummer deepened, emissaries from Antony and Cleopatra reached the eastern courts. Gold flowed like water, promises and threats moved with equal speed. In Parthia, envoys whispered of Antony's coming campaign. In Armenia, tribute ships laden with gifts set sail for Alexandria. Even in Judea, Herod himself sent word of reluctant support, his loyalty sealed with an oath heavy with reluctance and calculation. And yet, amid this gathering storm, Cleopatra sensed the tremor beneath the surface, the shifting winds of fate neither maps nor armies could command. One evening, standing alone upon the palace's western balcony, she gazed across the harbour, her heart caught between hope and a quiet, gnawing fear. The scent of the sea mingled with the soft song of a distant lyre drifting through the city's winding streets. What would history remember of her? A queen who dared to challenge Rome, a seductress who bewitched the mightiest men of her age, a mother who gambled everything upon the fragile shoulders of a single child, or simply a woman who dreamed too greatly. And so it was that the summer gave way to the first whispers of war. Julius Caesar, torn between the Senate's demands and his own heart's quiet rebellion, issued his proclamation, a summons for Mark Antony to return to Rome and account for his actions. The words were carefully measured, crafted to sound lawful, yet bearing the unmistakable undertone of a challenge. Antony read the summons in the dawn light aboard his flagship. The parchment trembled slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from the weight of finality. This was it. The line had been drawn. He folded the scroll with slow deliberation, his gaze lifting to the horizon where Alexandria shimmered in the distance. "Send word to Rome," he commanded Decimus Malleus. "Tell Caesar, I do not answer to Rome alone. I answer to the east and to a queen." Malleus bowed, understanding passing in a silent glance between general and soldier. The wheels of war, long creaking in shadowed silence, now turned with thunderous inevitability. In her private chamber, Cleopatra received Antony's message with neither smile nor sigh. She read the words penned in his strong, measured hand. "We stand as one." The dice are cast, and pressed the scroll gently against her heart. For a long moment she stood still in the hush of the fading night, the stars blinking softly in the skies above. Then, with a grace born of centuries of royal blood, she placed the scroll upon her table, turned toward the balcony, and whispered a single word into the wind. "Together." And thus the final act began, not with a battle cry nor with swords drawn, but with hearts entwined upon the edge of destiny. Antony and Cleopatra, bound by love, by ambition, by the dark truths they could no longer deny, stepped into the yawning abyss of history. The world would watch, empires would tremble, and in the quiet before the storm, two hearts beat as one against the gathering darkness.